There are places tucked away in the folds of the oldest maps that time has chosen to forget. Valleys where the sun seems to filter differently through the leaves, where the silence isn't peaceful, but expectant. Oakhaven was such a place. It didn't so much sit nestled in its remote, wooded hollow as it did fester. A collection of weathered, clapboard houses, a single, steeple-less church, and a general store whose windows were perpetually dusty. It presented an image of rustic, almost cliched, New England charm. But like a too-perfect porcelain doll, there was something in its stillness, in its perfectly maintained decay, that hinted at a hollowness within, a secret that held the painted smile in place. Into this meticulously preserved quietude drove Elara and Ben Thorne, their battered station wagon coughing a plume of exhaust that seemed an affront to the pristine, unnaturally clean air. Elara, the word feeling inadequate, almost a trespass. Ben, ever the optimist, or perhaps just desperate for this move to work, squeezed her shoulder. Quiet is good. Quiet is what we came for. Away from the city noise, the stress. Fresh air for you, for... He patted her stomach gently. For Junior, Elara tried to mirror his smile, but it felt like a costume. The quiet of Oakhaven wasn't the gentle hush of nature, the kind they'd imagined. It was a weighted silence, the kind that settles after a shared, unspoken tragedy, or before one is about to unfold. The few villagers they saw, an elderly woman sweeping a spotless porch, a man methodically stacking wood, his movements precise, almost ritualistic, didn't wave or offer friendly nods. They simply observed. Their eyes, when they met Elara's, were like chips of granite, impassive and unreadable, lingering just a moment too long before returning to their tasks. There was no hostility, not overtly, but no welcome either. Just a bland, unnerving assessment. Their new home, a rental secured through a terse, impersonal online listing, was at the very edge of the village, where the manicured lawns gave way to the encroaching, untamed woods. It was an old farmhouse, 2 stories of faded blue paint and a sagging porch, but it had, as a listing promised, character, and Elara soon discovered a peculiar, faint scent of dried herbs, and something else, something metallic and vaguely unsettling, that seemed to emanate from the very walls. Charming, isn't it? Ben said, trying to sound enthusiastic as he wrestled their largest suitcase from the car. A bit of a fixer-upper, maybe, but solid bones. Elara nodded, still feeling the weight of those assessing gazes. The bones feel old, she said, more to herself than to him. The air here was different. Their first week in Oakhaven passed in a blur of unpacking and attempts at settling in. Ben threw himself into minor repairs, but the silence pressed in. No children's laughter drifted from neighboring yards. No teenagers loitered on street corners. No friendly gossip was exchanged over fences. The village moved with a somber, almost synchronized rhythm, its inhabitants emerging for necessities and then retreating back into their homes as if drawn by an invisible tide. She was the village midwife, the only one for miles around, a tradition passed down through generations. It was said, she has the old ways. Mrs. Hendershaw, the stoic owner of the general store, had informed Elara, her voice flat, offering no further explanation when Elara had inquired about prenatal care. Everyone in Oakhaven goes to Madame Lavoie. Everyone. Elara, a city girl at heart, had envisioned a modern hospital birth, epidurals, and reassuring obstetricians. The thought of a village midwife, steeped in old ways, sent a shiver of apprehension down her spine. But Ben, after a few discreet inquiries, had confirmed Mrs. Hendershaw's words. There were no other options nearby, no clinics, no doctors who made house calls to a place as remote as Oakhaven. It was Madame Lavoie, or a perilous, hour-long drive over poorly maintained mountain roads while in labor. We'll at least meet her, Ben had said, his optimism fraying slightly at the edges. See what she's like. Maybe old ways just means herbal tea and a calming presence. Their appointment was set for the following Tuesday. Madame Lavoie's cottage was even more isolated than theirs, set deeper into the woods, accessible only by a narrow, winding dirt track that seemed to actively discourage visitors. The cottage itself was small, ancient, with a steeply pitched roof and windows like dark, watching eyes. Smoke curled from its stone chimney, carrying a scent that reminded Elara of the strange aroma in their own farmhouse. But stronger here, more potent, a mix of bitter herbs, wood smoke, and that same faint metallic tang. Madame Lavoie herself was a woman who seemed carved from the very granite of the surrounding hills. Tall, gaunt, with hair the color of iron filings pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin over her sharp cheekbones. Her eyes, though, were the most arresting feature. They were pale, her unformed fears. The interior of the cottage was dim, cluttered with bunches of dried herbs hanging from the rafters, shelves laden with glass jars containing unidentifiable substances, and strange, carved wooden implements whose purpose Elara couldn't begin to guess. There was no modern medical equipment in sight, only an old examination couch covered with a thick, hand-stitched quilt. "You are Elara," Madame Lavoie stated, her voice low and gravelly, like stones shifting in a riverbed. It wasn't a question. "And this is your first?" Elara nodded, feeling small and strangely vulnerable. "Yes, we just moved to Oakhaven." A flicker of something unreadable passed through Madame Lavoie's pale eyes. "Oakhaven chooses its own," she said, the cryptic remark hanging in the air. Her examination was surprisingly gentle, yet her hands were icy cold, even through Elara's clothes. She asked few questions, relying instead on a disconcerting intuition, her fingers palpating Elara's belly with an ancient, practiced skill. "A strong child," she pronounced finally, her gaze fixed on Elara's face. "A child of Oakhaven soon." The words, meant to be reassuring, perhaps, sent another chill through Elara. There was a possessiveness in the midwife's tone, a sense of claim that went beyond mere medical care. As they left the cottage, stepping back into the dappled sunlight that seemed reluctant to fully penetrate the woods around Lavoie's domain, Elara couldn't shake the feeling of having been weighed, measured, and found suitable for some unspoken purpose. The following Sunday, Elara overheard a hushed conversation at the general store. Sarah Hemlock, a young woman from a farm on the other side of the valley, had given birth. Madame Lavoie had attended, another quiet one. Mrs. Hendershaw murmured to a crony, her back to Elara, but her voice carrying in the unnatural stillness of the store. Just like all of Madame's blessings. "Praise be for the silence," the other woman replied, her voice equally low. "A good sign. Means the old ways hold." "A quiet one?" Elara frowned. "Babies cried. That's what they did. It was their first assertion of life, their demand on the world. The idea of silent birth was unnatural." She tried to dismiss it as local parlance, some quaint Oakhaven expression, but the words, "another quiet one," echoed in her mind, tinged with the unsettling atmosphere of Madame Lavoie's cottage and the watchful eyes of the villagers. A few days later, driven by a curiosity she couldn't quite suppress, Elara took a walk that led her past the Hemlock farm. She saw Sarah Hemlock sitting on her porch, rocking a bundle in her arms. From a distance, it looked like any scene of new motherhood. But as Elara drew slightly closer, pretending to admire some wildflowers by the roadside, she saw Sarah's face. It was pale, drawn, her eyes holding a vacant, haunted look rather than the glow of maternal joy. And the bundle in her arms was utterly, unnervingly still. Then, for a fleeting second, the blanket shifted. Elara caught a glimpse of the baby's face, its eyes. They were open, staring, and they were dark. Not dark blue, like many newborns, or even a deep brown. They were black, a flat, impenetrable, obsidian black, like polished stones. And in that brief, horrifying instant, Elara felt a cold dread grip her heart, a primal fear that whispered of things ancient, things wrong, things that Oakhaven kept hidden beneath its veneer of quiet, rustic peace. The baby in Sarah Hemlock's arms hadn't just been silent. It had been watching with eyes that held no light, no innocence, only an abyss. The foundation was set. The idyllic retreat was rapidly becoming a place of insidious horror, the promise of new life now overshadowed by an encroaching, silent dread. The mystery of Madame Lavoie and the silent, black-eyed children of Oakhaven had just begun to unfurl its terrifying tendrils. And Elara, with her own child soon to arrive, was standing at the very edge of its abyss. Chapter 1. Oakhaven's Embrace. The sign for Oakhaven, if it could even be called that, was a faded, moss-eaten plank of wood nailed crookedly to an ancient oak tree whose branches, gnarled and skeletal even in the late summer sun, seemed to claw at the sky. The letters, once perhaps a cheerful white, were now gray and peeling, barely legible against the weathered grain. It was less a welcome and more a warning, or perhaps a forgotten epitaph. Elara Thorne, her pregnant belly pressing uncomfortably against the seatbelt, felt a shiver trace its way down her spine, a sensation entirely at odds with the humid warmth of the afternoon. Beside her, Ben squinted, trying to decipher the name. Oakhaven. Well, at least the oak part is accurate, he offered, his voice a little too bright, a little too forced. He reached over and squeezed her hand, his palm warm and reassuring, a stark contrast to the chill that had just touched her. Almost there, Ellie. Just think, clean air, peace, and quiet. Our own little nest before the whirlwind arrives. Elara managed a weak smile. The peace and quiet part was precisely why they'd embarked on this slightly mad adventure, trading their cramped city apartment and incessant urban cacophony for a rented farmhouse in a village neither of them had ever visited. A place found through a cryptic online ad promising seclusion and rustic charm. The doctor had recommended less stress for the remainder of her pregnancy, and Ben, ever protective, ever resourceful, had seized upon Oakhaven as their sanctuary. Yet, as they turned off the county road onto a narrower, unpaved track that plunged them deeper into the dense, oppressive woods, Elara's unease intensified. The trees pressed in on either side, their foliage so thick it cast the road in a perpetual twilight. The silence here was profound, not the gentle, life-filled silence of the countryside she'd imagined, but a heavy, breathless stillness, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath, waiting. Even the birds seemed muted, their occasional calls sounding distant and forlorn. You know, Ben said, his knuckles white on the steering wheel as he navigated a particularly deep rut. The agent wasn't kidding about secluded. I half expect to see a "Here be dragons" note on the next tree. He was trying to lighten the mood, but Elara could hear the faint tremor of his own apprehension beneath the jest. They had been driving for what felt like an eternity since leaving the main highway, the GPS signal on Ben's phone having died an unceremonious death miles back, replaced by a blank, mocking screen. They were relying on a hand-drawn map provided by the letting agency. A curiously archaic document that seemed to emphasize landmarks like the Whispering Falls and Old Man Hemlock's boundary stone rather than actual road names. The air grew cooler, heavy with the scent of damp earth, decaying leaves, and something else, a faint, almost imperceptible sweetness like overripe fruit, that tickled the back of Elara's throat and made her stomach churn slightly. She rolled down her window, hoping for a breath of genuinely fresh air, but the cloying scent only intensified, mingling with the musty odor of the forest floor. "It feels old," she said, the word tasting inadequate on her tongue. Untouched, Ben nodded, his gaze fixed on the winding path ahead. That's the charm, right? Getting away from it all, back to basics. But even he couldn't entirely suppress the flicker of doubt in his eyes. The transition from the familiar world to this isolated enclave had been too abrupt, too complete. It felt less like a journey to a new home and more like a crossing into another realm, a place operating under different rules, a different sky. Finally, after a particularly sharp bend, the trees thinned, and they emerged, blinking, into a pocket of pale sunlight. Before them lay Oakhaven. It was quaint, deceptively so. A handful of houses, their wooden sidings painted in faded pastels, blues, greens, and a surprising number of yellows, clustered around a small, unpaved square. A whitewashed church, its steeple conspicuously missing a cross, stood at one end, and a general store with a broad, sagging porch occupied the other. Flowers bloomed in meticulously tended window boxes, vibrant splashes of color against the weathered wood. On the surface, it was the picture of rural serenity, the kind of village that might feature on an overly sentimental postcard. Yet, the silence persisted, an almost physical pressure against Elara's eardrums. No children played in the square. No dogs barked a welcome or a warning. The few figures they saw, a woman shaking out a rug on a distant porch, a man leaning against the wall of the general store, whittling a piece of wood, moved with a slow, deliberate economy of motion, their faces turned away or obscured by shadow. There was no curiosity in their posture, no sign that they'd even registered the arrival of a strange car. It was as if Elara and Ben were invisible, or worse, irrelevant. "Well, here we are," Ben announced, pulling the car to a stop near what looked like a village green, though it was more of a patch of neatly scythed grass than a manicured lawn. He cut the engine, and the sudden absence of its rumble amplified the unnerving stillness. "Charming, see? Told you. He was trying so hard." Elara leaned her head back against the seat, a wave of fatigue washing over her. "It's very tidy," she offered, tidy to the point of being sterile. Every blade of grass seemed to be in its correct place, every picket fence perfectly aligned. There was a rigidity to the village's appearance, a sense of order that felt less organic and more fiercely imposed. She unbuckled her seatbelt with a sigh, the click sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet. "Let's find the agent's contact. Mrs. Gable, was it? See about the keys." Mrs. Gable, according to their sparse correspondence, was the caretaker for their rental and lived in one of the houses fronting the square. The instructions had been simple: house with a blue door and the profusion of roses. Knock and announce yourselves. As they stepped out of the car, the air felt thick, almost viscous, carrying that same faint, sweet, and unsettling scent she'd noticed in the woods, now mingled with the aroma of wood smoke, even though it was a warm afternoon. Elara stretched, trying to work the kinks out of her back. Her gaze drifted across the square. The man who'd been whittling by the general store had stopped his work. He wasn't looking directly at them, but Elara felt the prickle of his awareness, a sidelong, assessing glance that made the hairs on her arms stand up. His face was shadowed by the brim of a wide hat, but she could sense the intensity of his unseen scrutiny. The woman who had been shaking the rug had disappeared back into her house, the door closing with a soft, decisive click. "Friendly bonge," Ben muttered, trying for a light tone, but not quite succeeding. He'd seen it too, the subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the village's atmosphere upon their arrival. Not a welcome, but a tightening, a closing of ranks. He slung his bag over his shoulder. Blue door, roses. Should be easy enough to spot. The house with the blue door was, indeed, festooned with roses. Great blousy blooms in shades of crimson and pale pink, their scent a heady, almost overwhelming counterpoint to the underlying sweetness in the air. It was undeniably pretty, yet even here, the perfection felt a little off. The roses were too perfect, too uniform, as if sculpted from wax rather than grown. Ben knocked, a series of firm raps that echoed oddly in the stillness. They waited. No sound came from within. He knocked again, louder this time. "Mrs. Gable? It's Elara and Ben Thorne. We're here for the farmhouse rental." Silence. Elara shifted uncomfortably, feeling exposed, standing on the doorstep. The unseen eyes of Oakhaven seemed to be pressing in on them. She glanced back at the general store. The whittler was gone. The porch was empty. A curtain twitched in an upstairs window of the house opposite. Just as Ben was about to knock a third time, the blue door creaked open a few inches, revealing a sliver of a woman's face. Pale and deeply lined, dominated by a pair of startlingly light gray eyes that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. "Aye." A voice rasped, dry as autumn leaves. "Mrs. Gable?" Ben asked, injecting a warmth into his tone that Elara knew he didn't feel. "We're the Thorns, from the city. We have the rental agreement for the Miller place." The light gray eyes flickered over them, a slow, methodical assessment that lingered a moment too long on Elara's swollen belly. A strange expression, unreadable and unsettling, crossed the woman's face before it smoothed back into a look of blank neutrality. "I knew you were coming," Mrs. Gable said, her voice devoid of inflection. She opened the door wider, though not wide enough to invite them in. She was a small, bird-like woman, dressed in a shapeless dark dress that seemed to absorb what little light reached the shaded porch. Her silver hair was pulled back into a severe bun, accentuating the sharpness of her features. "Keys are here." She held out a single, large iron key, its surface worn smooth with age. "House is unlocked. Directions are as you had. End of the lane, past the old well." "Thank you," Elara said, trying to sound polite. "Is there anything we should know about the house or Mrs.?" Gable's gaze sharpened. "House is old. Makes its noises. Don't trouble it. It won't trouble you." Her eyes flicked again to Elara's stomach. "Midwife's Madame Lavoie. Only one there is. She'll know when it's time." The pronouncement was delivered with an unnerving certainty, as if Madame Lavoie possessed some arcane knowledge that transcended mere medical calendars. Before Elara or Ben could ask what she meant, Mrs. Gable pressed the key into Ben's hand. "Water pump can be fickle. Best to let it run a bit first. Woodpile stock for the stove. Stores open till 6, mostly." Her delivery was clipped, efficient, offering information in stark, unadorned pronouncements. There was no warmth, no welcome, just a transaction completed. Then, as if suddenly remembering a forgotten courtesy, she added, "Hope your stay is peaceful." The word peaceful sounded odd on her lips, almost a parody of itself, given the village's oppressive atmosphere. And with that, the blue door creaked shut, leaving Elara and Ben standing on the porch, the heavy iron key feeling cold in Ben's palm. "Well," Ben said, letting out a slow breath. "She's concise." Elara nodded, a knot of anxiety tightening in her chest. She seemed to know about the baby, and this Madame Lavoie. "Small village, Ellie," Ben said, trying to sound reassuring. "Word gets around, and it's natural they'd only have one midwife this far out." But his eyes betrayed his own unease. The encounter with Mrs. Gable had done little to dispel the feeling that Oakhaven was not merely a quiet village, but a place wrapped in layers of unspoken rules and watchful silence. As they walked back to the car, Elara couldn't shake the feeling of Mrs. Gable's pale eyes on her back, or the peculiar emphasis she'd placed on Madame Lavoie's prescience. The air still hung heavy and sweet, the silence broken only by the crunch of their shoes on the gravel path and the distant, mournful cry of that same lone bird. The houses around the square remained still, their windows like vacant eyes. Yet, Elara knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that they were being watched. Every movement, every word, catalogued by the unseen inhabitants of this too perfect, too quiet village. Oakhaven's embrace felt less like a welcome and more like the slow, inexorable closing of a trap. The peace they had sought seemed to be of a different, more sinister kind than they had ever anticipated. Their rented farmhouse, the Miller place as Mrs. Gable had called it, stood at the very end of a narrow, overgrown lane, further removed from the village center than Elara had anticipated. It leaned a little, as if weary from standing sentinel against the encroaching forest for too many generations. The faded blue paint was peeling in long strips, revealing weathered gray wood beneath, and the porch sagged noticeably on one side. Ivy, thick and tenacious, climbed the stone chimney, its tendrils probing at the window frames like questing green fingers. Yet, there was a stubborn dignity to the old house, a sense of enduring history that Elara found strangely compelling, despite her unease. "Character, right?" Ben said, his voice echoing slightly in the stillness as he shouldered their heaviest bags. Lots and lots of character. He unlocked the front door with a heavy iron key, the mechanism groaning in protest before finally yielding with a dull thud. The air that billowed out from within was cool and musty, carrying the distinct, layered scent of damp wood, old ashes, dust, and something else, that same faint, sweet, herbal aroma she'd noticed in Madame Lavoie's woods. But here it was fainter, almost a memory, woven into the very fabric of the house. Inside, the farmhouse was larger than it appeared from the outside, with a warren of small, shadowy rooms leading off a central hallway. Dust motes danced in the few shafts of sunlight that penetrated the grimy window panes. The furniture was sparse and utilitarian, a sturdy wooden table and chairs in the kitchen, a couple of threadbare armchairs in what might have been a parlor, and simple bedsteads in the upstairs rooms. Everything was covered in a fine layer of dust, suggesting the house had been empty for some time, yet there was an odd sense of recent occupancy, a feeling that someone had only just stepped out. An old farmer's almanac, dated from the previous year, lay open on the kitchen table beside a chipped ceramic mug. Charming in a rustic, possibly haunted sort of way, Elara commented, running a finger across the dusty tabletop, leaving a clean streak. She tried to sound lighthearted, but the house's oppressive quiet, broken only by the creak of floorboards under their feet and the sigh of the wind in the eaves, was beginning to wear on her. Ben, ever practical, was already checking the ancient-looking fuse box in the hallway. "Power's on, at least. Let's see about this fickle water pump," Mrs. Gable mentioned. He found it in the scullery, a hulking, iron monstrosity that looked like it belonged in a museum. After several grunting attempts, it coughed, sputtered, and then, with a groan that seemed to shake the entire house, began to disgorge a stream of rusty water into the stone sink. Gradually, the water cleared, running cold and surprisingly sweet. They spent the rest of the afternoon in a flurry of forced activity, airing out rooms, wiping down surfaces, and beginning the Sisyphean task of unpacking. Ben built a fire in the parlor's large stone fireplace, more for the cheerfulness of the flames than for warmth, and the crackling wood did, for a time, manage to push back the heavy silence. But as evening approached and the shadows lengthened, the house seemed to reclaim its quietude, the firelight casting unsettling, dancing shapes on the walls. Elara found herself starting at every creak and groan, her nerves stretched taut. The sounds were ordinary house sounds. She told herself, the settling of old timbers, the wind in the chimney. But in Oakhaven, nothing felt ordinary. While Ben made a tentative foray to the general store for essential supplies, returning with a sparse selection and the report that the storekeeper, a taciturn man named Silas, had barely spoken a word, Elara explored the upstairs. The bedrooms were small and cramped, with low ceilings and small, deep-set windows that offered limited views of the encroaching woods. In what was presumably the master bedroom, she found a small, child-sized rocking chair tucked away in a corner, its wood worn smooth with age. An inexplicable sadness washed over her as she looked at it, a sense of lives lived and lost within these walls. She touched its curved back gently, and it swayed with a soft, rhythmic creak, like a sigh. Later, as they ate a simple meal of canned soup and bread at the kitchen table, the silence of Oakhaven pressed in on them again, heavier now with the onset of night. Outside, the woods were an impenetrable wall of blackness, the only sounds the chirping of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl, sounds that seemed to emphasize, rather than alleviate, the profound isolation. "So," Ben said, breaking a long silence, "first impressions of Oakhaven, aside from its overwhelming chattiness?" Elara picked at her bread. "It's intense, the quiet, the way everyone seems to be watching but not engaging. And Mrs. Gable was a bit unsettling, wasn't she? Especially her certainty about this Madame Lavoie." Ben nodded slowly. "Yeah, she'll know when his time was a bit much. But look, it's a small, isolated community. They're bound to be insular, wary of outsiders. Probably haven't had new blood here in generations. We just need to give it time, let them get used to us. He was trying to convince himself as much as her. And this Madame Lavoie. Elara continued, unable to shake the image of the midwife's pale, knowing eyes. Did Mrs. Gable say she was the only one? Seems that way. Probably a local institution. We'll make an appointment. Check her out. If we don't like her, we'll figure something else out. Worst comes to worst, we drive to Hollowell for your checkups. It's not ideal, but it's doable. Hollowell was the nearest town of any significant size, nearly an hour's drive away. Assuming the mountain roads were clear. That night, sleep was elusive for Elara. The old house groaned and sighed around them, a symphony of unfamiliar sounds. The wind whispered in the eaves, sounding like hushed, indistinct voices. Twice, she thought she heard a soft tapping at the window, but when Ben, roused by her restlessness, went to check, there was nothing there but the dark glass reflecting their lamplit room and the pressing blackness of the woods beyond. The faint, sweet, herbal scent seemed stronger in the bedroom, almost cloying, and Elara found herself breathing shallowly, as if afraid to draw too much of it in. She lay awake for hours, listening, her hand resting protectively on her belly, a nameless dread coiling in her stomach. The silence of Oakhaven wasn't empty. It was full of unspoken things, of an ancient, watchful presence. And Madame Lavoie, the midwife who would know when it's time, loomed large in her thoughts, a shadowy figure at the heart of this unsettling place. Elara felt a deep, instinctual urge to flee, to pack their bags and drive away from Oakhaven as fast as they could. But she also knew that Ben had invested so much hope and their dwindling savings into this move. And where would they go? Back to the city, to the stress and the noise they had tried so desperately to escape? She was trapped, not just by her pregnancy, but by circumstance, by the insidious quiet of this forgotten village. As dawn finally began to gray the sky, painting the small window with a pale, melancholic light, Elara drifted into an uneasy sleep, her dreams filled with images of silent, watchful eyes and ancient, gnarled trees reaching for her with skeletal branches. Oakhaven's embrace was tightening, and the promised peace felt more like a suffocating shroud. The initial unease was solidifying into a genuine fear, a premonition that their search for sanctuary had led them to the very threshold of a nightmare. Chapter 2. The Midwife of Whispers. The following days in Oakhaven settled into a strange, disquieting routine. Ben, with a determined, almost frantic energy, threw himself into making the farmhouse habitable, repairing loose floorboards, patching a leak in the scullery roof, and attempting to tame the overgrown garden. His constant activity was a bulwark against the oppressive silence, a noisy defiance in the face of the village's watchful stillness. Elara, her energy levels fluctuating wildly with the advancing pregnancy, tried to create pockets of normalcy within the old house. She cleaned, arranged their few familiar belongings, and spent hours staring out of the grimy kitchen window at the unmoving wall of trees that marked the edge of their property. The woods seemed to press closer each day, their shadows deeper, their silence more profound. She found herself listening intently, straining to hear any sound beyond the rustle of leaves or the occasional bird call, but the forest remained stubbornly, unervingly mute. It was as if all life within its depths moved with a preternatural stealth, or was simply absent. Their interactions with the villagers remained minimal and stilted. Trips to the general store for supplies were met with the same impassive curiosity, the same clipped, uninformative responses from Silas, the storekeeper, a gaunt man with eyes so pale they seemed almost colorless. Other villagers they encountered on the single street or in the square would offer a curt nod, their gazes sliding past Elara and Ben without truly acknowledging their presence. There were no friendly overtures, no casual conversations, no invitations to a welcoming cup of coffee. It was an isolation more profound than mere physical remoteness. It was a deliberate, collective shunning, a clear message that they were outsiders tolerated but not accepted. Elara felt it most keenly. The women, in particular, seemed to avoid her gaze, their faces tightening almost imperceptibly when they saw her, their eyes flicking to her swollen belly with an expression she couldn't decipher. Was it pity, disapproval, or was something else, something darker? The name Madame Lavoie continued to surface in hushed, oblique references. When Elara, attempting to make conversation with a woman tending a small vegetable patch near the church, had asked about local doctors or clinics, the woman had simply straightened, wiped her hands on her apron, and said, "Madame Lavoie sees to Oakhaven's needs. Always has." Her tone brooked no further discussion, her eyes holding a warning that Elara didn't dare ignore. It became increasingly clear that Madame Lavoie was not just a midwife. She was an institution, an authority figure whose influence permeated every aspect of life in Oakhaven. Her name was a password, a shibboleth, separating those who belonged from those who did not. And Elara, carrying a child who would, by necessity, be brought into the world under Lavoie's care, felt increasingly like a pawn in a game whose rules she didn't understand. The faint, sweet, herbal scent that clung to their farmhouse, and indeed to the very air of Oakhaven, she now associated irrevocably with the unseen midwife. It was the scent of Lavoie's domain, a subtle but constant reminder of her pervasive presence. One afternoon, desperate for a change of scenery and a brief respite from the claustrophobic confines of the farmhouse, Elara decided to take a walk. Ben was wrestling with a stubborn patch of weeds at the far end of the garden, his grunts and curses a small, human sound in the vast quiet. "Don't go too far," he called after her, his face smudged with dirt, his eyes filled with a concern that mirrored her own growing apprehension. "And stick to the main path," Elara promised. Though the idea of a main path in Oakhaven, where every track seemed to lead either to a closed door or deeper into the unnerving woods, felt like a contradiction in terms. She walked slowly towards the village square, her steps heavy on the dusty road. The sun was high, but its warmth seemed unable to penetrate the chill that clung to Oakhaven. The houses stood silent and watchful, their windows like vacant eyes. She passed the church, its missing cross giving it a strangely pagan, unfinished look. The door was closed, a heavy, ancient oak plank that looked as if it hadn't been opened in years. As she neared the general store, she saw a small group of women gathered on the porch, their heads bent together in quiet conversation. Their voices were low, a soft murmur that didn't carry far, but their collective posture spoke of shared secrets, of an intimacy from which Elara was pointedly excluded. As she approached, the conversation ceased abruptly. The women turned, their faces impassive, their eyes assessing her with that same unsettling, unreadable expression. Elara offered a hesitant smile and a tentative, "Good afternoon." One of the women, older than the others, with a stern, unyielding face and hair the color of faded straw, nodded curtly. "Afternoon," she said, her voice flat. The others remained silent, their gazes unwavering. Elara felt a flush creep up her neck. The air crackled with unspoken things. She wanted to ask them about Madame Lavoie, about the births in Oakhaven, about the unnerving silence that seemed to characterize the village's children, for she had yet to see or hear a single child playing, laughing, or crying in Oakhaven. But the words died in her throat, withered by the wall of their collective, silent disapproval. She mumbled another, "Nice day," and hurried past, feeling their eyes on her back like a physical weight. Further on, near the edge of the square, she saw something that made her pause. A young woman, perhaps not much older than Elara herself, was sitting on a bench beneath a large, spreading maple tree, a baby carriage beside her. Hope flickered in Elara's chest. Perhaps here was someone she could talk to, another young mother, someone who might understand her anxieties. As she drew closer, however, her steps slowed. The young woman was staring straight ahead, her expression strangely blank, her hands resting limply in her lap. The baby carriage was old-fashioned, its wicker hood pulled low, obscuring its occupant from view. But what struck Elara most was the silence. The woman wasn't cooing to her baby or humming a lullaby or even gently rocking the carriage. She was just sitting there as still and silent as the village around her. And from the carriage, there came no sound at all. No gurgly, no vimpir, no hastily stiving. Only a profound, unnerving stillness. Elara hesitated, an icy premonition gripping her. This must be Sarah Hemlock, the woman whose quiet one she had overheard Mrs. Hendershaw discussing. She remembered the fleeting, horrifying glimpse of the baby's black, vacant eyes. Swallowing her fear, driven by a desperate need for connection, for any crumb of normalcy, Elara approached the bench. "Hello," she said softly. "I'm Elara Thorne. We just moved into the old Miller place." The young woman turned her head slowly. Her eyes, when they met Elara's, were dull and lifeless, surrounded by dark circles, as if she hadn't slept in weeks. It took a moment for her to register Elara's presence. "Sarah," she said, her voice a mere whisper, thin and reedy. "Sarah Hemlock." Elara gestured towards the carriage. "You have a new baby? Congratulations. Boy or girl? A flicker of something? Pain? Fear?" Crossed Sarah Hemlock's face before it settled back into that unnerving blankness. "A boy," she whispered. "Madame Lavoie," she delivered him. The name hung in the air between them, heavy and laden with unspoken meaning. "He's quiet," Elara said, choosing her words carefully, fishing for information. Sarah Hemlock's gaze drifted to the carriage, a strange, haunted look in her eyes. "Yes," she said, her voice barely audible. "They're all quiet. Madame Lavoie's babies. It's a blessing, they say, a sign of Oakhaven's peace." Her lips curved into a faint, joyless smile that didn't reach her eyes. "A blessing," Elara repeated, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. Do you mind if I take a peek?" she asked, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had to know. She had to see for herself if what she'd glimpsed before was real, or was just a trick of the light, a product of her overactive imagination. Sarah Hemlock didn't answer, didn't move. She simply continued to stare straight ahead, as if Elara were no longer there. Taking her silence as permission, Elara slowly, hesitantly, reached for the hood of the carriage. Her hand trembled. The air around the carriage felt colder, the sweet, herbal scent more pronounced. She pulled back the wicker hood, and then she saw him. The baby lay nestled in a cocoon of white blankets, his tiny fists clenched, his face pale and still. He was beautiful in a stark, porcelain way, but his eyes were wide open, staring directly up at her. And they were exactly as she remembered, exactly as she had feared. They were not the innocent, unfocused eyes of a newborn. They were pits of utter, unreflective blackness, like holes burned into his face, absorbing all light, giving nothing back. There was no pupil, no iris, just a solid, terrifying void. And in their depths, Elara sensed an ancient, chilling intelligence, a knowingness that had no place in the face of an infant. The baby made no sound, no movement save for the slow, deliberate blink of those horrific black eyes. Elara gasped, stumbling back from the carriage, a hand flying to her mouth to stifle a scream. The world tilted, the quaint village square swimming before her eyes. This wasn't natural. This wasn't a blessing. This was an abomination. Sarah Hemlock turned her head slowly, her lifeless eyes fixing on Elara's horrified face. A tiny, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. "They're all like that," she whispered, her voice a chilling confirmation of Elara's worst fears. The children of Madame Lavoie, the silent children of Oakhaven. Elara felt the blood drain from her face, a sickening, cold dread washing over her in waves, threatening to buckle her knees. She stared at Sarah Hemlock, at the ghastly, knowing emptiness in the young woman's eyes, which seemed to mirror the terrifying voids in her babies. All of them, Elara choked out, her voice a strangled whisper. "But why? What does it mean?" Sarah's faint, chilling smile remained. "It is the way of Oakhaven," she said, her voice flat, reciting words that sounded learned, rehearsed, devoid of any genuine emotion. Madame Lavoie ensures the peace. The children, they are part of that peace. They do not cry. They do not fuss. They are serene. Serene. The word was a grotesque understatement for the unnatural stillness, the profound, chilling otherness that emanated from the black-eyed infant in the carriage. Elara wanted to scream, to shake Sarah Hemlock, to demand answers, but a paralyzing fear held her rooted to the spot. The air in the square, once merely oppressive, now felt actively malevolent, thick with an ancient, unspoken horror. The meticulously tended flower beds, the neatly painted houses, the very silence of Oakhaven, all seemed to take on a sinister new meaning, a carefully constructed facade hiding an unbearable truth. But their eyes, Elara managed, her gaze darting back to the carriage, to that unblinking obsidian stare. Their eyes are not normal. A flicker of something, a brief, agonizing spark of what might have been maternal pain, crossed Sarah Hemlock's face, so fleeting Elara almost missed it. Then it was gone, replaced by that same terrifyingly placid mask. Madame Lavoie says they see more than we do, Sarah murmured, her voice dropping even lower, as if sharing a sacred, terrible secret. They see the hidden things, the old things. It is a gift. A gift? Elara felt a surge of revulsion. This was no gift. This was a mark, a brand, a sign of something deeply, fundamentally wrong. She thought of her own unborn child, kicking and squirming within her a vibrant, insistent life. The idea that her baby could be born like that, silent, watchful, with those soulless black eyes, filled her with a primal terror that eclipsed everything else. I have to go, Elara stammered, backing away from the bench, from Sarah Hemlock and her silent, black-eyed progeny. She couldn't bear to be near them, couldn't bear to look into those horrifying eyes any longer. The sweet, herbal scent in the air now seemed cloying, suffocating, the smell of decay and unnatural things. Sarah Hemlock didn't try to stop her. She simply watched Elara retreat, her faint, unsettling smile unwavering. As Elara turned to flee, her gaze swept across the square. The few villagers who had been present earlier were gone. The porches were empty, the windows blank. But she felt their eyes, dozens of them, unseen but palpable, watching her from the shadows of their homes, from behind their perfectly aligned picket fences. They knew, they all knew, and they were part of it. This conspiracy of silence, this acceptance of the monstrous. Elara broke into a clumsy run, her breath catching in her throat, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She didn't stop until she reached the overgrown lane leading to their farmhouse, stumbling through the door and bolting it behind her. His face etched with alarm. He knelt beside her, his hands on her shoulders, his touch grounding her, pulling her back from the brink of hysteria. Through ragged sobs, Elara recounted what she had seen, what Sarah Hemlock had told her. The silent baby, the pitch-black eyes, the chilling pronouncements about Madame Lavoie and OakHaven'S peace. Ben listened, his initial alarm giving way to a grim, stony disbelief. Black eyes, he repeated, his brow furrowed. Completely black? Are you sure, Ellie? Maybe it was the light or... No, Elara insisted, grabbing his arm, her nails digging into his skin. It wasn't the light. They were empty, Ben, like holes. And Sarah, she was so calm, so dead inside. She said they're all like that. All of Madame Lavoie's babies. Ben's face paled. He had tried to rationalize the village's strangeness, to dismiss Elara's earlier fears as pregnancy-induced anxiety. But the raw terror in her eyes, the conviction in her voice, was undeniable. This was not just about an insular community or an eccentric midwife. This was something far more sinister. Okay, he said, his voice tight with a controlled anger. Okay, we need to think. There has to be a rational explanation. Rational? Elara cried, her voice rising. What's rational about babies born without pupils? Ben, what's rational about a village where no child ever makes a sound? This place, it's not right. It's evil. Ben pulled her into his arms, holding her tight as she trembled. I know, he soothed, though his own heart was now thudding with a fear that mirrored hers. But we can't panic. We need to be smart about this. He stood up, pacing the small kitchen, his mind racing. This Madame Lavoie, she's the key. Everything seems to revolve around her. We need to find out more about her, about these births. I don't want her anywhere near me, Ben. Elara sobbed. Or near our baby. We have to leave. Now. We can't stay here. And go where, Ellie? Ben said, his voice heavy with the weight of their predicament. We've sunk everything into this place. Our lease in the city is gone. We have nowhere else to go. Not right now. Not with the baby due so soon. His practicality, usually a comfort, now felt like a trap. They were caught, ensnared by circumstance and by the insidious web of Oakhaven. But there must be something we can do, he continued, more to himself than to her. Their loss, child welfare. We can report this. There has to be someone outside this village who can help. His words, however, rang hollow even to his own ears. Oakhaven felt like a world unto itself, cut off from the outside, operating under its own ancient, unspoken laws. Who would they report it to? The nearest town, Hollowell, was an hour away, and they had no car phone, their cell signals non-existent. And what would they say? That the babies in Oakhaven were born with black eyes and never cried? It sounded like madness, like the ravings of a hysterical pregnant woman and her overwrought husband. They would be dismissed, ridiculed, or worse. Word would get back to Oakhaven, to Madame Lavoie, and who knew what _dreadful_ consequences that might bring. The villagers, with their watchful eyes and silent complicity, seemed fiercely protective of their peace, of their old ways. Elara looked at Ben, her eyes wide with a dawning, terrible understanding. They won't let us leave, will they? She whispered. Not with the baby coming. They want our baby to be like theirs. The thought was so horrific, it stole her breath. Ben's face was grim. He didn't answer, but the fear in his eyes was a chilling confirmation. They were no longer just visitors in Oakhaven. They were prisoners marked by the impending birth of their child. A child that Oakhaven and its terrifying midwife clearly intended to claim. The silence of the house, once merely unsettling, now seemed to thrum with a palpable menace. The sweet, herbal scent, a constant, suffocating reminder of the darkness that lay at the heart of this cursed village. The dream of a peaceful sanctuary had shattered, replaced by the terrifying reality of their entrapment. The encounter with Sarah Hemlock and her silent, black-eyed child irrevocably shifted the atmosphere in the Thorne household. The creeping unease that had haunted their first days in Oakhaven solidified into a tangible, ever-present fear. Every creak of the old farmhouse, every sigh of the wind in the eaves, every shadow that danced in the periphery of their vision now seemed freighted with sinister meaning. Sleep became a nightly battle, Elara plagued by vivid, terrifying nightmares of Madame Lavoie. Her face a mask of ancient secrets, her hands reaching for Elara's swollen belly, and of babies with eyes like polished jet, their silent stares following her through endless, labyrinthine corridors. Ben, though he tried to maintain a facade of calm for Elara's sake, found himself starting at every unexpected sound, his night spent listening to the unnerving stillness of Oakhaven, a stillness he now understood to be anything but peaceful. He began to lock the doors and windows obsessively. Even during the day, a futile gesture against an enemy that felt intangible, pervasive, woven into the very fabric of the village. They spoke in hushed tones, even within the supposed privacy of their rented home, as if afraid the walls themselves had ears, and perhaps they did. The sweet, herbal scent that permeated the house, once merely a curiosity, now seemed like a constant, subtle surveillance, a reminder of Madame Lavoie's unseen influence. Elara found herself compulsively cleaning, scrubbing at imaginary residues, trying to banish the scent, but it clung stubbornly to the air, to the furniture, to their clothes. It was the scent of Oakhaven, the scent of its dark secret. Ben made a few more furtive attempts to gather information. He tried to engage Silas, the storekeeper, in casual conversation, hoping to glean some scrap of local history, some hint about the origins of Oakhaven's peculiar traditions, or about Madame Lavoie herself. But Silas remained stubbornly taciturn, his pale eyes deflecting every inquiry, his answers monosyllabic and unhelpful. The other villagers were equally impenetrable, their faces closed, their manner guarded, their loyalty to Oakhaven and its midwife absolute. It was like chipping away at a wall of granite with a teaspoon. One evening, poring over the archaic, hand-drawn map that had guided them to Oakhaven, Ben noticed something he hadn't seen before, a faint, almost erased marking deep in the woods, beyond the boundaries of the village proper. It was a small, circular symbol, with spidery lines radiating from its center, labeled in faded ink with a single, barely legible word. Chapel. A chapel, Elara said, peering over his shoulder. Not the church in the square. Ben shook his head. No, this is different. Way out in the woods. See? It's not even on any of the marked paths. A desperate idea began to form in his mind. If Madame Lavoie was the keeper of Oakhaven's secrets, perhaps this forgotten chapel held some clue, some forgotten piece of history that could explain the unnatural horror that gripped the village. It was a long shot, a desperate grasping at straws, but it was better than passively waiting for their child to be born into this nightmare. I'm going to try and find it, Ben announced, his jaw set with a grim determination. Tomorrow, while there's still light. Elara protested, her eyes wide with fear. Ben, no, it's too dangerous. Those woods, they're not safe. And what if someone sees you? I'll be careful, he insisted. I'll stick to the tree line as much as possible. I have to do something, Ellie. We can't just sit here and wait for her. The next morning, under a sky the color of lead, Ben set out. Elara watched him from the kitchen window, her heart a cold knot of dread in her chest, as he disappeared into the dense, uninviting trees at the edge of their property. The woods swallowed him almost immediately, his figure dissolving into the shadows as if he had never been. The hours that followed were an agony of suspense for Elara. She paced the confines of the farmhouse, jumping at every sound, her imagination conjuring all manner of horrors that might befall Ben in those silent, watchful woods. She tried to read, to distract herself, but the words on the page blurred, her mind returning again and again to the image of Sarah Hemlock's vacant stare and the terrifying black eyes of her silent child. The house felt colder, emptier, without Ben's presence. The silence more profound, more menacing. Meanwhile, Ben pushed deeper into the woods than he had ever dared venture before. The air here was thick and damp, heavy with the scent of decaying leaves and pine needles. The silence was absolute, broken only by the snap of twigs under his feet and the ragged sound of his own breathing. The trees grew close together, their branches interlacing overhead, filtering the already weak sunlight into a dim, greenish twilight. He consulted the crude map frequently, trying to match its vague landmarks. A lightning-struck oak, a cluster of unusual rock formations, with his surroundings. It was slow, arduous work. The undergrowth was thick, thorny vines snatching at his clothes, unseen roots threatening to trip him. More than once, he had the unnerving sensation of being watched, the feeling of unseen eyes following his progress from the depths of the forest. He would stop, listen intently, scan the surrounding trees, but there was never anything there. Only the silent, indifferent woods. After what felt like hours, when he was beginning to despair of ever finding it, he stumbled upon a barely discernible track, little more than a faint depression in the forest floor, overgrown with moss and ferns. It led upwards toward a small rise. His heart quickened. This had to be it. He followed the faint path, his senses on high alert, and then, through a break in the trees, he saw it. The chapel. It was smaller than he had imagined. Little more than a one-room stone structure, its walls gray and weathered, covered in patches of lichen and creeping ivy. The roof, made of slate tiles, sagged precariously in the middle, and several tiles were missing, leaving dark, gaping holes. The windows were narrow, slit-like openings boarded up from the inside with rough wooden planks. The door, a heavy slab of dark, age-blackened wood, was ajar, hanging crookedly on one rusted hinge. The air around the chapel felt colder than the surrounding woods, and the silence here was different, heavier, imbued with a sense of ancient, sorrowful neglect. There was no sign of recent use, no path worn to the door, only the encroaching wilderness slowly reclaiming its own. With a growing sense of trepidation, Ben approached the chapel. He pushed the heavy door further open, the rusted hinge groaning in protest, the sound echoing eerily in the stillness. The interior was dark and musty, the air thick with the smell of damp stone, rotting wood, and something else. Something acrid and faintly metallic, like old blood. What little light filtered through the cracks in the boarded-up windows revealed a scene of utter desolation. Rough-hewn wooden benches lay overturned, covered in dust and cobwebs. The altar, a simple stone slab at the far end, was bare, save for a thick layer of grime and a scattering of what looked like dried leaves or feathers. And then he saw them, carved into the stone walls, into the altar, even into the few remaining intact floorboards, were symbols, strange, spidery sigils, unlike anything he had ever seen before. Some resembled the circular marking on his map, but others were more complex, more disturbing, angular, twisted shapes that seemed to writhe and coil like serpents. They were not Christian symbols, nor did they resemble any pagan runes he was familiar with. They felt older, darker, imbued with a primal, unsettling power. His gaze was drawn to the wall behind the altar. There, larger and more deeply incised than the others, was a particularly disturbing carving. It depicted a grotesque, vaguely humanoid figure with elongated limbs and a featureless, oval head. Its hands were raised, and from its fingertips, lines radiated outwards, connecting to smaller, stick-like figures, children, who surrounded it. And beneath the figure, carved with a chilling precision, were what looked like rows upon rows of tiny, empty circles. Eyes, hundreds of them, staring. Ben felt a wave of nausea wash over him. This was no ordinary chapel. This was a place of dark worship, of forgotten, terrible rites. He backed away, his hand instinctively going to his mouth, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. He had found more than he had bargained for. He had stumbled into the very heart of Oakhaven's darkness, a place that reeked of ancient evil and unspeakable sacrifices. He had to get out, to get back to Elara, to warn her. As he turned to flee, his foot caught on something lying hidden in the shadows near the doorway. He stumbled, catching himself against the doorframe. Looking down, he saw what he had tripped over. It was a small, leather-bound book, its cover mildewed and warped with age. Its pages were brittle, yellowed, and filled with cramped, spidery handwriting. It looked like a journal or a ledger. His heart pounded. With trembling hands, he picked it up. This, he knew with a sudden, chilling certainty, was what he had truly come to find. Ben's fingers, numb with a mixture of cold and dread, fumbled with the rotted leather ties that held the small, ancient book shut. The cover was blank, featureless, save for the patina of age and the faint, almost imperceptible stain of something dark, like dried blood, near one corner. He cast a furtive glance back into the oppressive gloom of the tiny, desecrated chapel, then out towards the silent, watching woods. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to get as far away from this unholy place as possible. But the weight of the book in his hand, the promise of answers, however terrible, held him captive. He had to know. For Elara, for their unborn child. Taking a deep, ragged breath, he managed to undo the ties. The book fell open in his hands, its pages stiff and fragile, emitting a dry, dusty odor that mingled with the chapel's miasma of decay and old iron. The script within was tiny, crabbed, written in a faded brown ink that was difficult to decipher in the dim light. It was clearly a journal, a meticulously kept record, though of what, he couldn't immediately tell. The entries were dated, some going back decades, perhaps even further, the older ones almost illegible. He flipped through the brittle pages, his eyes scanning the spidery handwriting. Names, dates, brief, cryptic notations. Then a particular phrase, repeated with unsettling regularity, jumped out at him. Infant-born, silent, eyes of the deepest night. A cold dread seeped into Ben's bones, chilling him more thoroughly than the damp air of the forgotten chapel. He sank onto a fallen, moss-covered log just outside the doorway, his legs suddenly weak, his gaze devouring the horrifying entries. Page after page detailed births in Oakhaven. Each entry stark, clinical, yet imbued with an undercurrent of something profoundly unnatural. Hemlock male, strong, silent, eyes of the deepest night. The old one is pleased. Proctor, female, frail but accepted, silent, eyes of the deepest night. The tithe is paid. Gable, twins, both male. A bounty, both silent, eyes of the deepest night. The pact endures. The names were familiar, echoes of the silent, watchful villagers he and Elara had encountered. Gable, Hemlock, Proctor, generations of Oakhaven families, all linked by this horrifying legacy of silent, black-eyed children, and the recurring references to the Old One, the tithe, the pact. What ancient, terrible bargain had Oakhaven made? He read on, his horror mounting with each turn of the page. The journal was not just a record of births. It was a chronicle of a dark covenant, a pact made with some unspeakable entity that resided in the woods, in the earth, perhaps even beneath the very foundations of Oakhaven itself. The silent children were not merely a strange local anomaly. They were offerings, or perhaps conduits, part of an ongoing appeasement. The journal spoke of lean years, of failed crops, of sickness, when the Old One was displeased, and of times of prosperity, when the tithe of silent children was plentiful. And then he found her name, Lavoie. Not Madame Lavoie, not yet, but an earlier Lavoie. Then another, and another, each entry detailing her role as midwife, as the one who ushered the chosen ones into the world, the one who tended the old ways. It was a lineage, a dark inheritance passed down through generations of Lavoie women, guardians of this terrible secret, facilitators of this unholy pact. The current Madame Lavoie was merely the latest in a long line of priestesses serving this ancient, malevolent power. Ben's blood ran cold. The sweet, herbal scent that permeated Oakhaven, the scent he associated with Madame Lavoie, suddenly took on a new, horrifying significance. It was not the scent of healing, but of sacrifice, of something old and deeply unnatural. He thought of Elara, her body nurturing their child, a child who, in the eyes of Oakhaven and its terrifying midwife, was undoubtedly destined to be another silent one, another offering to the Old One. The journal didn't explicitly state what happened to the children or what the Old One truly was, but the implications were monstrous. The tiny, empty circles carved into the chapel wall behind the altar, the eyes, now seemed to represent these generations of silent, black-eyed infants, their gazes fixed on some unseen, unknowable horror. He slammed the journal shut, his hands trembling so violently he could barely hold it. He felt sick, violated, as if he had peered into the very abyss that lay beneath Oakhaven's deceptively placid surface. He had to get this book to Elara. They had to find a way out, a way to escape before Madame Lavoie knew it was time. Clutching the journal to his chest, Ben scrambled to his feet and plunged back into the woods, driven by a desperate urgency. He no longer cared about sticking to the tree line or moving stealthily. He crashed through the undergrowth, heedless of the branches that tore at his clothes and skin. His only thought to get back to the farmhouse, to Elara. The woods seemed darker now, more menacing, the silence no longer indifferent but actively hostile. He imagined eyes watching him from every shadow, the ancient, unseen presence of the Old One, stirring in its subterranean lair, aware of his trespass, of the sacrilege he had committed by uncovering its secrets. He ran, his lungs burning, his heart pounding. The horrifying words from the journal seared into his mind. Silent. Eyes of the deepest night. The old one is pleased. He burst out of the woods into the relative clearing of their rented property, his appearance wild, his clothes torn, his face pale and scratched. Elara, who had been watching from the window, her face a mask of anxiety, rushed out to meet him, her earlier fear replaced by a new terror at the sight of his distress. "Ben, what happened? Are you all right?" she cried, her voice trembling. He couldn't speak, not yet. He grabbed her hand, pulled her back inside the farmhouse, and bolted the door, his eyes darting nervously towards the silent, watchful woods. He leaned against the door, gasping for breath. The ancient journal clutched in his white-knuckled grip like a talisman against the encroaching darkness. "I found it," he finally choked out, his voice raw. "The chapel. And this." He held out the small, leather-bound book. Elara stared at it, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and dawning understanding. The book looked ancient, evil, radiating an almost palpable aura of malevolence. "What is it?" she whispered, her gaze fixed on the dark stain on its cover. Ben sank into a chair at the kitchen table, his body trembling with exhaustion and horror. "It's a journal," he said, his voice hoarse. "A record, kept by the Lavoies. Generations of them." He opened the book, his hand shaking, and pointed to one of the damning entries. "Read this, Ellie. Read it and you'll understand. You'll understand what this place really is." Elara leaned over his shoulder, her eyes tracing the faded, spidery script. Her breath hitched in her throat as she read the chillingly familiar words. "Infant-born. Silent. Eyes of the deepest night." She read entry after horrifying entry, her face growing paler with each revelation. The names of Oakhaven families, the references to the Old One, the tithe, the pact. The truth, more monstrous than anything she could have imagined, unspooled before her in the brittle, yellowed pages of the Lavoie journal. This was not just a village with a strange custom. It was a cult, a place bound by a blood pact to some ancient, malevolent entity, and the silent, black-eyed children were the currency of that pact. Madame Lavoie was not merely a midwife. She was a high priestess, a gatekeeper of this horrific tradition. And Elara's own child, their precious, unborn baby, was slated to be the next offering. A strangled sob escaped her lips. She pressed her hands to her mouth, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it threatened to shatter her sanity. "Oh God, Ben," she whispered, her voice trembling. "What have we stumbled into? What are we going to do?" Ben reached across the table and took her hand, his grip surprisingly firm despite the tremor that still shook his body. His face was grim, but his eyes held a new, desperate resolve. "We're going to get out of here, Ellie," he said, his voice low and determined. "Tonight, we pack what we can carry and we leave. We walk if we have to. We are not letting them have our baby." The Lavoie journal lay open on the table between them, a testament to Oakhaven's ancient evil, its secrets finally, terrifyingly, laid bare. But knowledge was a double-edged sword. They now knew the truth, but did the Old One and its earthly servant, Madame Lavoie, know that they knew? The silence of Oakhaven outside their bolted door suddenly felt charged, expectant, as if the entire village and the ancient, slumbering power beneath it was holding its breath, waiting for their next move. Chapter 3. Under Lavoie's Shadow. The decision, once made, brought a strange, chilling clarity. The fear was still there, a cold serpent coiling in Elara's stomach, but it was now overlaid with a desperate, almost feral determination. They would not be passive victims. They would not surrender their child to the monstrous traditions of Oakhaven. As twilight bled into a starless, oppressive night, they moved with a quiet, frantic urgency, packing a few essential belongings into 2 worn backpacks, some clothes, the last of their non-perishable food, Ben's hunting knife, and, most importantly, the Lavoie journal, now wrapped carefully in an old oilskin bag. Every sound from outside, the rustle of leaves, The distant hoot of an owl, the creak of the farmhouse settling, sent jolts of adrenaline through them. They spoke in whispers, their ears straining for any sign that their discovery had been detected, that Madame Lavoie or her silent, watchful villagers were already moving against them. The sweet, herbal scent in the air seemed to intensify, a cloying, insidious presence, as if Lavoie herself were breathing down their necks. "We wait until after midnight," Ben whispered, his eyes constantly scanning the darkened windows. "Deepest part of the night. Hopefully, most of them will be asleep." He had studied the crude map again, tracing a potential escape route. Not back along the main track towards a village, which would surely be watched, but west, deeper into the woods. Aiming for an old logging trail marked on the map that, if it still existed, might eventually lead them towards Hollowell. It was a perilous gamble. The woods were vast, uncharted, and, as they now knew, home to something ancient and malevolent. But it was their only chance. Staying in Oakhaven was a death sentence for their child, and perhaps for them as well. Elara, her body heavy and awkward, her nerves stretched to the breaking point, tried to focus on the practicalities. She double-checked their meager supplies, her hands trembling as she folded a tiny baby blanket, a wave of protective fury washing over her. They would not take her child. She would die first. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. They sat in the dim kitchen, the Lavoie journal lying on the table between them like a venomous snake, a constant reminder of the horrors they were trying to escape. Neither of them could eat. The silence of Oakhaven pressed in, a suffocating weight. Around 11, a faint, rhythmic sound began to drift from the direction of the village, a low, resonant drumming, almost subliminal at first, then growing steadily in intensity. It was a slow, deliberate beat, like a giant, unseen heart pulsing in the darkness. Elara and Ben exchanged terrified glances. What was it? Some ritual? A signal? Was it for them? The drumming continued, a monotonous, unsettling thrum that vibrated through the very floorboards of the farmhouse. A soundtrack to their mounting dread. "They know," Elara whispered, her voice barely audible above the pounding in her own ears. "They know we know." Ben shook his head, though his face was pale, his eyes wide with apprehension. "We don't know that, Ellie. It could be anything. Some local custom. We stick to the plan. Midnight, but the drumming and the palpable sense of unseen." Hostile attention eroded their resolve. By 11:30, the air in the farmhouse felt thick, unbreathable, charged with an almost electric tension. The rhythmic thrumming from the village seemed to be calling to something in the woods, something ancient and responsive. "I can't wait any longer, Ben," Elara said, her voice tight with panic. "We have to go. Now." Ben hesitated for a moment, then nodded grimly. The risk of leaving earlier was great, but the risk of staying, of waiting for Madame Lavoie to come for them, was infinitely greater. He slung his backpack over his shoulder and took Elara's hand. "Stay close to me," he whispered, "and don't look back." He unbolted the kitchen door, his hunting knife clutched in his other hand. The night air that greeted them was cold and damp, carrying the scent of pine, decaying leaves, and that ever-present, sweet, herbal aroma, now mingled with the faint, disturbing scent of wood smoke from the village, even though it was not a cold night. The drumming was louder out here, a primal, insistent rhythm that seemed to make the very ground beneath their feet tremble. They slipped out of the farmhouse and into the oppressive darkness of the Oakhaven night, moving like shadows towards the western edge of the property, away from the village, away from the source of the ominous drumming. The moon was a pale sliver, obscured by thick clouds, offering little illumination. They relied on Ben's memory of the terrain and the faint starlight that filtered through the canopy of the ancient, gnarled trees. The woods were a terrifying labyrinth of black shapes and unseen obstacles. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sounded unnaturally loud, magnified by their heightened senses and the overwhelming, rhythmic pulse of the distant drums. Elara, burdened by her pregnancy and the suffocating fear, struggled to keep up with Ben's desperate pace. Her breath came in ragged gasps, a searing pain stitching her side. But the thought of her unborn child, of the silent, black-eyed infants in Madame Lavoie's thrall, spurred her on. They had been stumbling through the darkness for what felt like an eternity, Ben periodically checking the compass on his watch. When they heard it, a sound that froze the blood in their veins. A howl, long, mournful, and utterly inhuman, it echoed through the woods, seeming to come from all directions at once. It was not the cry of a wolf or a coyote. It was something else, something older, something that spoke of unimaginable hunger and ancient sorrow. The drumming from the village, which had been a constant, oppressive presence, suddenly stopped. The silence that descended in its wake was even more terrifying, heavy with an unholy anticipation. Then another howl, closer this time, followed by a crashing sound in the undergrowth, as if something large and heavy were moving through the trees, paralleling their path. "They're hunting us," Elara whimpered, clutching Ben's arm, her eyes wide with terror. Ben didn't reply. His face was a mask of grim determination, his knuckles white as he gripped the hunting knife. He pulled Elara behind a thicket of ancient rhododendrons, pressing her down, his body shielding hers. "Stay quiet," he breathed, his voice barely a whisper. "Don't move." The crashing in the undergrowth grew louder, closer. They could hear heavy, panting breaths, a guttural, snuffling sound, as if something were scenting the air, searching for them. Elara squeezed her eyes shut, praying with a fervor she hadn't known she possessed. She could smell it now, a rank, musky odor like wet fur and damp earth, mixed with the faint, sweet scent of Lavoie's herbs. It was close, agonizingly close. Then silence. The crashing stopped. The panting ceased. For a moment, Elara dared to hope that it had passed them by, that they had evaded whatever monstrous thing was stalking them through the Oakhaven woods. But then a new sound reached their ears, a sound that was in its own way, even more terrifying than the howls or the crashing. It was a soft, almost gentle footfall, not the heavy tread of whatever creature had been pursuing them, but the light, deliberate step of a human, or something that walked like a human. Ben slowly, cautiously, peered through the leaves of the rhododendron, his breath caught in his throat. Standing not 20 feet away, bathed in a sickly sliver of moonlight that had momentarily broken through the clouds, was Madame Lavoie. She was not dressed in her usual drab, homespun attire. Instead, she wore a long, dark, hooded robe, embroidered with the same strange, spidery sigils that Ben had seen carved into the walls of the forgotten chapel. Her face, in the anemic moonlight, looked ancient, timeless, her pale eyes glowing with an eerie, internal luminescence. She held a gnarled staff in one hand, and in the other, a small, intricately carved wooden fetish, disturbingly similar to the grotesque figure he had seen on the chapel altar. She was not looking in their direction. Her head was tilted, as if listening to something they could not hear, her lips moving silently, as if in communion with the unseen spirits of the woods. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, she raised her head and turned her gaze directly towards their hiding place. Her pale eyes seemed to pierce the darkness, to see right through the rhododendron leaves, to fix upon Elara and Ben with an unnerving, chilling certainty. A faint, knowing smile touched her lips. "You cannot run from Oakhaven's embrace, children." Her voice rasped, low and resonant, carrying through the stillness of the woods with an unnatural clarity. "The old one calls, and the tithe must always be paid." The monstrous, unseen creature in the woods let out another blood-curdling howl. Closer now, much closer, as if in answer to its mistress's summons. Madame Lavoie took a step towards them, her eyes gleaming, her smile widening, revealing teeth that seemed, in the deceptive moonlight, just a little too long, a little too sharp. The shadow of Oakhaven and its terrifying midwife had finally, irrevocably, fallen upon them. Chapter 4. The Silent Delivery. Dawn found Elara and Ben huddled together for warmth at the base of the moss-covered boulder, chilled to the bone, their clothes damp with dew, their bodies aching with exhaustion. The woods around them were eerily still, the earlier cacophony replaced by a silence so profound it felt unnatural, pregnant with an unspoken threat. The immediate pursuit seemed to have ceased, but the oppressive sense of being watched, of being hunted, remained. They had managed to snatch a few hours of fitful, nightmare-ridden sleep, but true rest was impossible. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, sent jolts of fear through them. Ben had tried to get his bearings using the compass on his watch, but in the dense, unfamiliar woods, with no clear landmarks and the constant threat of discovery, it was almost useless. They were lost, disoriented, and terrifyingly alone. "We need to keep moving," Ben said, his voice hoarse, as the first pale, gray light of morning filtered through the dense canopy. "We can't stay here. Lavoie knows these woods. She'll find us." Elara nodded, her face pale and drawn, dark circles under her eyes. The events of the previous night felt like a fever dream, a terrifying descent into a reality she still struggled to comprehend. Madame Lavoie's demonic fury, the monstrous howls of the unseen creature, the desperate gamble with the journal. It all seemed too grotesque, too surreal to be true. Yet, the aching fear in her heart, the protective clenching of her womb around their unborn child, was all too real. She pushed herself to her feet, her body protesting with every movement. The baby, which had been relatively quiet during their frantic flight, now began to stir, a series of uncomfortable kicks and prods that reminded Elara, with a fresh wave of terror, that her time was running out. The peaceful birth she had once envisioned had become a terrifying race against an encroaching, ancient evil. They set off again, driven by a desperate urgency. Their progress slow and arduous. The woods seemed to actively conspire against them, the undergrowth thicker, the terrain more treacherous. They had no food, and the few sips of water remaining in their single bottle were precious. Hunger gnawed at Elara's stomach, and a dizzying weakness threatened to overwhelm her. Ben, though clearly exhausted himself, tried to remain strong, scouting ahead, helping Elara over fallen logs and through dense thickets, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings for any sign of pursuit. The silence of the woods was unnerving. Nobert sang, nos guedes chateth. It was as if all life had fled before some unseen, approaching menace. Or perhaps, Elara thought with a shudder, the woods themselves were in league with Madame Lavoie and the Old One, their silence a conspiratorial hush. Around mid-morning, as they were forcing their way through a particularly dense patch of thorny bushes, Elara cried out, a sharp, sudden intake of breath. She stumbled, clutching her belly, her face contorting in pain. Ben was at her side in an instant, his eyes wide with alarm. "Ellie, what is it?" "The baby." Elara nodded, her breath coming in ragged gasps. "A contraction," she managed, her voice tight with pain and fear. "A strong one." Panic seized Ben. "Not now. Please, not now." They were miles from anywhere, lost in a hostile wilderness, with a vengeful midwife and a monstrous entity hunting them. This was the worst possible time, the worst possible place for Elara to go into labor. "Okay," he said, trying to keep his voice calm, though his heart was hammering against his ribs. "Okay, breathe, Ellie. Just breathe. We need to find shelter somewhere safe." But where was safe in OakHaven's's cursed woods? Every shadow seemed to hide a threat, every rustling leaf a portent of doom. The contractions began to come more frequently, each one a fresh wave of agony that stole Elara's breath and sapped her strength. She leaned heavily on Ben, her face pale and beaded with sweat, her eyes filled with a mixture of pain and terror. They pressed on, their desperation fueled by the imminent arrival of their child. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Ben spotted it, a small, dilapidated hunter's blind, half hidden in a dense copse of pine trees, near a small, stagnant stream. It wasn't much, just a few rotting planks cobbled together, but it offered a modicum of shelter, a place where Elara could at least lie down. He helped her inside, clearing away the worst of the debris, his hands shaking as he tried to make her as comfortable as possible on the rough, uneven floor. The blind was cramped, musty, and offered little protection from the elements, let alone from Madame Lavoie. But it was all they had. Elara's labor progressed with terrifying speed. The contractions came one after another, relentless, overwhelming, each one tearing a pained cry from her lips. Ben did his best to comfort her, to coach her through her breathing, but he was woefully unprepared for this. He was not a doctor, not a midwife. He was just a terrified husband, watching the woman he loved suffer, powerless to alleviate her pain. Acutely aware of the horrors that lurked just beyond the flimsy walls of their makeshift shelter. The silence of the woods outside seemed to press in on them, amplifying Elara's cries, making them sound small and terribly vulnerable. He kept imagining Madame Lavoie's pale, knowing eyes, her gnarled hands, her chilling pronouncements about the tithe. Was she out there listening, waiting, her ancient power guiding her towards them? As the afternoon wore on, Elara's strength began to wane. Her cries became weaker, her face ashen. "I can't do this, Ben," she sobbed, her voice hoarse with exhaustion and pain. "I can't." "Yes, you can, Ellie," Ben urged, his voice thick with unshed tears, his hand gripping hers tightly. "You're strong. You have to be strong. For our baby." He knew, with a chilling certainty, that if their child was born here, in these cursed woods, without protection, without escape, its fate was sealed. Madame Lavoie would find them, and she would claim her prize. The sweet, herbal scent, Lavoie's olfactory signature, seemed to be growing stronger, carried on the faint breeze that rustled the pine needles outside their flimsy shelter. Or was it just his imagination, his fear manifesting itself in phantom smells? He didn't know. He didn't want to know. He focused on Elara, on the miracle and the terror of a life that was struggling to enter this blighted world. Then, with a final, desperate cry that seemed to tear through the very fabric of the oppressive silence, Elara gave one last, shuddering push, and their child was born. A boy, small, perfect, covered in vernix and blood. He lay still and silent in Ben's trembling hands. Silent, utterly, terrifyingly silent. No cry of life, no whimper of protest. Just an unnerving, profound stillness. Ben's heart plummeted. He stared at his son, his beautiful, silent son, a cold dread gripping him, so intense it threatened to suffocate him. He had seen this before in the Lavoie journal. The chillingly familiar description, infant born, silent. He looked at Elara. Her eyes were closed, her face chalky white, her breathing shallow. She was exhausted, hovering on the brink of unconsciousness. She hadn't seen. She didn't know. Not yet. With trembling fingers, Ben cleared the baby's airway, his medical knowledge rudimentary but instinctive. Still, no kurai. He gently rubbed the baby's back, trying to stimulate a breath, a sound, anything. Nothing. The silence in the small, cramped hunter's blind was absolute, broken only by Elara's faint, ragged breaths and the frantic hammering of Ben's own heart. Then, slowly, hesitantly, the baby's eyes fluttered open, and Ben found himself staring into the same terrifying, unholy voids he had read about, the same abyssal blackness Elara had described with such horror. Pitch black, no pupil, no iris, no reflection of light, only a solid, impenetrable darkness, staring up at him with an ancient, chilling intelligence that had no place in the face of newborn. His son, their son, marked by Oakhaven, claimed by the Old One. Ben felt a despair so profound it threatened to swallow him whole. He had failed, despite everything, despite their desperate flight, their defiance, they had failed. Oakhaven had won, as if summoned by the silent birth, by the arrival of another chosen one. A new sound reached Ben's ears from the woods outside. It was a soft, rhythmic rustling, a light, deliberate footfall. approaching their makeshift shelter. And with it, carried on the still afternoon air, came the unmistakable, cloying, sweet scent of herbs. Madame Lavoie. She had found them. She had known when it was time. Ben looked down at his silent, black-eyed son, then at Elara's pale, unconscious form. He was trapped, utterly and irrevocably trapped. The shadow of Oakhaven had not just fallen upon them, it had consumed them. And the price, he now knew with a chilling, soul-destroying certainty, was about to be paid in full. A low, guttural chuckle, like stones shifting in a dry riverbed, emanated from just outside the flimsy hunter's blind. The old one is patient. Little father, Madame Lavoie's voice rasped. Closer than Ben could have ever imagined, her words seeping through the rotting planks like a poisonous miasma. But its hunger is eternal. And the new blood always sings the sweetest song. Ben's blood ran cold. He could see her silhouette through the cracks in the wall, a tall, dark, hooded figure, her gnarled staff tapping lightly on the forest floor, a rhythm that echoed the terrifying drumming from the village. She was alone, but her presence filled the small clearing with an ancient, overwhelming power. The musky, rank odor of the unseen creature, the old one's monstrous familiar, was absent, but the air thrummed with a different kind of menace, the focused, predatory intent of the midwife herself. "He is a fine one," Lavoie continued, her voice a horrifying parody of maternal pride. "Strong and silent, as it should be, a true child of Oakhaven." Ben clutched his son, his silent, black-eyed son, protectively to his chest, his mind racing, searching desperately for some way out, some last defiant act. But there was nothing. He was weaponless, exhausted, his spirit crushed by the horrifying confirmation of their child's cursed state. Elara moaned softly, her eyelids fluttering. She was stirring, coming back to consciousness, unaware of the nightmare that awaited her. "What do you want, Lavoie?" Ben choked out, his voice hoarse, his gaze fixed on the dark silhouette outside. "You have your offering. Just leave us alone. Let Elara live." Another dry chuckle. "Oh, the mother is important, little father. Very important. She has proven fertile, resilient. The old one appreciates such strength. Perhaps she will provide Oakhaven with many more silent blessings in the years to come." The implication was monstrous. They were not to be released. Elara was to become a broodmare for this ancient, insatiable entity, her life dedicated to producing more black-eyed offerings for Oakhaven's dark god. Rage, hot and fierce, momentarily eclipsed Ben's terror. "Never," he snarled, his voice raw with fury. "I'll kill you first." Lavoie's laughter was like the rustle of dry leaves. Such spirit, such fire. The door of the hunter's blind, a flimsy construction of rotting wood, creaked open, pushed by the tip of Lavoie's gnarled staff. She filled the narrow opening, her face shadowed by her hood, her pale eyes gleaming with an unholy light. The sweet, herbal scent that clung to her was overpowering, cloying, making Ben's stomach churn. "Give me the child," she commanded, her voice soft now, almost seductive, yet underscored with an unyielding, terrifying authority. It is time for him to be presented. The old one grows impatient. Ben recoiled, pressing his son tighter against his chest. "No," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I won't let you take him." Lavoie's eyes narrowed. "Do not be foolish, little father. You cannot resist. No one can resist the will of Oakhaven. The pact is ancient. The power is absolute." She took a step into the cramped blind, her presence sucking the very air from the small space. Ben could see her face more clearly now. Her skin, like old parchment, stretched taut over sharp cheekbones, her lips thin and bloodless. She looked ancient, timeless, a creature of nightmare and shadow. "Ben," Elara's voice, weak and disoriented, came from behind him. "Ben, what's happening? The baby, is he?" Her voice trailed off as she saw Madame Lavoie, her eyes widening in terror. Ben turned slightly, her gaze flicking towards Elara with a cold, appraising interest. Good. She should witness the blessing. She should understand the honor that has been bestowed upon her. She reached out a gnarled, claw-like hand towards the baby. "Give him to me." Ben flinched away, but Lavoie was surprisingly strong, her grip like iron as she seized his arm. He struggled, but it was no use. She was preternaturally powerful, her strength belying her gaunt, aged appearance. With a swift, brutal movement, she twisted his arm, forcing him to release his hold on their son. "No!" Elara screamed, struggling to sit up, her eyes wild with terror and maternal fury. "Don't touch him. Leave my baby alone." Madame Lavoie ignored her, her attention focused solely on the silent, black-eyed infant now cradled in her arms. She cooed at him, a horrifying, guttural sound, her pale eyes gleaming with a possessive, triumphant light. "Such a beautiful child," she crooned. "So quiet, so knowing. He will serve the old one well." She turned, preparing to leave the blind, her dark purpose accomplished. But Elara, fueled by a desperate, primal rage, lunged forward. She grabbed Lavoie's arm, her nails digging into the midwife's flesh, her teeth bared in a snarl. "You will not take him!" she shrieked, her voice raw with pain and defiance. Lavoie, surprised by the ferocity of Elara's attack, stumbled, her grip on the baby momentarily loosening. In that instant, Ben saw his chance. His only chance. It was a suicidal, insane act. But he couldn't let Lavoie win, couldn't let her take their son without a fight. He threw himself at the midwife, not with his fists, but with his entire body, aiming to knock her off balance. To create a diversion, however brief, he slammed into her with all his remaining strength. Lavoie, caught between Elara's desperate assault and Ben's unexpected attack, let out a startled cry, a sound more animal than human. She staggered, her staff clattering to the floor, and the baby, their silent, black-eyed son, slipped from her grasp. He fell not onto the hard, unforgiving floor of the hunter's blind, but into a pile of soft, decaying leaves and pine needles that had accumulated in one corner. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Lavoie, Elara, and Ben stared at the small, still form of the infant, lying amidst the detritus of the forest floor. Then a sound, a small, hesitant, almost inaudible whimper, followed by another, louder this time, and then a cry, a thin, reedy, but unmistakably human cry. The baby, their silent, black-eyed son, was crying, really crying, a sound of distress, of life, of protest against the cold, the shock, the unnatural world into which he had been born. Madame Lavoie stared at the crying infant, her face a mask of utter disbelief, her pale eyes wide with a dawning, horrified understanding. The silence was broken. The pact, perhaps, was shattered. The blackness in the baby's eyes seemed to flicker, to waver, as if a veil were being lifted. For a fleeting instant, Ben thought he saw a hint of blue, of a normal, human iris, struggling to emerge from the terrifying, obsidian depths. "Impossible," Lavoie whispered, her voice trembling, her earlier arrogance gone, replaced by a raw, visceral fear. "It cannot be. The old one it will not allow." She backed away from the crying child, her eyes darting nervously towards the woods outside, as if expecting some monstrous retribution to erupt from their shadowy depths. The sweet, herbal scent around her seemed to diminish, to lose its cloying potency. Elara, her face a mixture of astonishment, terror, and dawning hope, scrambled towards her son, scooping him in her arms, cradling him against her breast, tears streaming down her face. He was crying. Her baby was crying. It was the most beautiful, terrifying sound she had ever heard. Ben stared, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The fall. Had the shock of the fall somehow broken the curse? Or was it something else? Elara's defiance? His own desperate intervention? Or had the Lavoie journal, cast into the woods, somehow disrupted the ancient power, weakened the old one's hold? He didn't know. He didn't care. All that mattered was that their son, for now, seemed changed. Madame Lavoie, Her face contorted with a mixture of rage and terror, turned and fled from the hunter's blind, disappearing into the woods with a speed that belied her age. She did not look back. She did not utter another word. She simply vanished, like a phantom dissolving into the shadows. Elara and Ben were left alone in the cramped, musty shelter with their crying, and watchful. And the old one, they knew, was still out there, its hunger undiminished, its power perhaps only temporarily disrupted. Their ordeal was far from over. It had merely entered a new, even more uncertain and terrifying phase. Chapter 5, The Weight of Stillness. The cry, so alien and yet so profoundly welcome, eventually subsided, replaced by the soft, exhausted snuffles of a newborn. Elara held her son close, her body trembling with a mixture of elation, disbelief, and a bone-deep weariness. He was warm, real, his tiny fingers clutching at her worn shirt. His eyes, when they briefly fluttered open again, were still unnaturally dark, but the terrifying, impenetrable blackness seemed less absolute. There was a hint, just a faint, almost imperceptible lightening around the edges, as if the obsidian depths were receding, revealing the faintest suggestion of a deep, stormy blue beneath. It was too soon to tell, too soon to hope, but the change, however subtle, was undeniable. He was no longer the silent, soulless effigy he had been moments before. He was a baby, a human baby, vulnerable and alive. Ben, his own shock slowly giving way to a fragile, tentative relief, gently wiped Elara's tear-streaked face with the hem of his ragged shirt. He cried, "Ellie," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He actually cried. It was a miracle, a reprieve, a defiance against the ancient, suffocating evil of Oakhaven. But the woods outside remained a silent, brooding presence, and the memory of Madame Lavoie's horrified flight, and her whispered fears of the Old One's retribution hung heavy in the air. They were not safe. Not yet. Perhaps they would never be truly safe again. The hunter's blind, once a desperate, last-ditch shelter, now felt like a trap, a flimsy defense against the inevitable backlash. Lavoie would recover from her shock. She would return, perhaps with the villagers, perhaps with something even more terrifying, or the Old One itself, its ancient pact violated, its power challenged, would unleash its fury upon them. "We have to move," Ben said, his voice low and urgent, even as he watched Elara cradle their son. "We can't stay here. She knows where we are." Elara nodded, her gaze fixed on her baby's face. The thought of venturing back into those cursed woods, with a newborn, with her own body battered and weak, was terrifying. But the thought of Lavoie returning, of those pale, predatory eyes falling upon her son again, was infinitely worse. "Where can we go?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Oakhaven is all around us." Ben's mind raced. The logging trail on the old map. It was their only hope, however slim. If they could find it, if it still existed, it might lead them out of Lavoie's immediate reach, perhaps even towards Hollowell. It was a desperate gamble, but it was better than waiting passively for the inevitable. He tore a strip of cloth from his already tattered shirt and gently cleaned their son, his movements clumsy but tender. He had no swaddling clothes, no blankets other than the thin, worn one Elara had packed. He wrapped the baby as best he could in the remnants of his shirt, trying to conserve the infant's precious body heat. They named him Samuel, a name that meant God has heard, a desperate prayer whispered into the oppressive silence of the Oakhaven woods. With Elara leaning heavily on him, her steps slow and unsteady, and Samuel clutched tightly in her arms, they stumbled out of the hunter's blind and back into the twilight of the forest. The air felt colder now, the silence more profound, more menacing. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sounded like a footfall of pursuer. The woods seemed to watch them, the ancient trees like silent, disapproving sentinels. They moved slowly, painstakingly, been trying to navigate by the fading light and his increasingly unreliable memory of the crude map. Elara, though weak and in pain, pressed on, driven by a primal maternal instinct to protect her child. Samuel, nestled in her arms, remained quiet, his earlier cries having exhausted him. He slept, his small face peaceful, yet the unnatural darkness of his eyes, even when closed, was a constant, chilling reminder of the shadow that still clung to them. Night fell, swift and absolute, plunging the woods into an impenetrable blackness. They had no light, no fire, only the faint, unreliable glow of Ben's watch face to guide them. They were forced to stop, to huddle together at the base of a large, gnarled oak, the same kind of tree that had marked the entrance to Oakhaven, its branches now seeming to claw at the starless sky like skeletal fingers. Elara nursed Samuel, her body aching, her fear a constant, gnawing presence. Ben kept watch, his hunting knife clutched in his hand, his ears straining for any sound, his eyes trying to pierce the oppressive darkness. The silence of the Oakhaven night was no longer merely quiet. It was a sentient thing, a predatory entity, waiting, listening, judging. He thought of the Lavoie journal, its horrifying secrets now presumably consumed by the Old One or lost in the depths of the woods. Had its destruction truly weakened the ancient power, or had it merely enraged it further? There was no way to know. Sometime in the deepest, darkest hours of the night, as Elara dozed fitfully, her head resting on Ben's shoulder, Samuel began to fuss. Not a cry, not yet, but a restless stirring, small, discontented whimpers. Elara woke instantly, her senses on high alert. She tried to soothe him, to quiet him, but his whimpers grew louder, threatening to escalate into a full-blown wail. Panic seized her. A crying baby in these silent, cursed woods was a beacon, a summons to whatever horrors lurked in the darkness. Ben pressed a finger to his lips, his eyes wide with alarm. They listened, their breath held, their hearts pounding. And then they heard it, a faint sound, distant but unmistakable. A low, rhythmic chanting, interspersed with the sharp, percussive clang of metal on metal. It was coming from a direction of Oakhaven village. The villagers, they were searching, or perhaps they were performing some ritual, some rite to appease their enraged god, to reclaim the child that had defied their ancient pact. The chanting grew louder, closer. They could hear voices now, a guttural, monotonous drone, punctuated by eerie, high-pitched yelps. And with the chanting came a new sound, a sound that chilled Elara and Ben to the core, the baying of hounds. Not ordinary hunting dogs, but something larger, deeper-throated, their cries echoing through the woods with a savage, bloodthirsty hunger. Lavoie was not relying on her own preternatural senses or the monstrous power of the Old One alone. She had unleashed the villagers, her loyal, fanatical followers, and their terrifying hounds, to hunt them down. The weight of their son's stillness, which had once been a source of such profound terror, now seemed almost a blessing in disguise. His cries had ceased, his earlier fussing giving way to an unnerving, watchful quiet. But the damage was done. They had been heard, and now they were being hunted like animals. The brief, fragile hope that had flickered to life with Samuel's first cry was extinguished, replaced by a cold, stark despair. Oakhaven was relentless. Its darkness was inescapable, and the silence that now enveloped their small, fugitive family was no longer a reprieve. It was the calm before the inevitable, terrifying storm. The baying of the hounds grew closer, a terrifying, relentless chorus that echoed through the black, unyielding woods. Ben knew they couldn't stay put. They were exposed, vulnerable, their scent undoubtedly already carried on the night air to the keen noses of Lavoie's hunting pack. He gently shook Elara awake from the light, exhausted doze she had fallen into. "We have to move," he whispered, his voice tight with urgency. "They're too close." Elara's eyes snapped open, wide with a renewed terror. The chanting, the clanging, the savage howling of the dogs. It was a symphony of impending doom. She clutched Samuel tighter, his small, unnervingly quiet form a fragile weight against her chest. He wasn't crying now, wasn't even fussing. He was utterly still, his dark eyes, had they been open, surely fixed on some unseen point in the oppressive darkness, as if listening, waiting. This unnatural stillness, which had once been a mark of Oakhaven's curse, now felt like their only shield, their only desperate hope of evading detection. They stumbled on through the pitch-black forest, their progress agonizingly slow, their fear a palpable entity that clung to them like a shroud. Ben tried to lead them away from the sounds of the hunt, but the woods were a disorienting labyrinth, and the baying of the hounds seemed to come from all directions at once, as if they were surrounded. Elara, her body screaming in protest, her strength failing, leaned heavily on Ben, her breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. Samuel remained unnervingly quiet in her arms, his stillness a stark contrast to the frantic terror that consumed his parents. Was it a conscious act, this silence? Did some vestige of Oakhaven's ancient influence still hold sway over him? Some primal instinct for self-preservation in the face of the hunt? Or was it merely the exhaustion of a newborn pushed beyond its limits? Elara didn't know. She only knew that his silence, for now, was their only ally. The ground beneath their feet grew steeper, more treacherous. They were climbing, though Ben had no clear idea of their destination. He was simply trying to put as much distance as possible between them and their pursuers. The chanting seemed to be falling slightly behind, but the baying of the hounds remained terrifyingly close, sometimes sounding as if they were just beyond the next thicket. Sickening crack, pain white-hot and blinding, shot up his leg. He collapsed, his face contorted in agony, the crude map fluttering from his grasp, lost in the darkness. Elara rushed to his side, her own exhaustion momentarily forgotten in a fresh wave of terror. Ben, are you all right? He gritted his teeth, tried to push himself up, but a fresh wave of nausea and pain washed over him. My ankle, he gasped. I think it's broken. Despair, cold and absolute, threatened to engulf Elara. Ben, her protector, her guide, was injured, perhaps incapacitated. They were lost, hunted with a newborn child in the heart of a cursed wilderness. This was the end. There was no escape. The hounds bayed again, closer now, their cries triumphant, as if sensing their prey was cornered, crippled. But then, Samuel, who had been preternaturally still in Elara's arms, let out a small, almost inaudible whimper. And in that instant, something shifted in Elara. The despair, the terror, receded, replaced by a cold, fierce resolve, a primal maternal fury that she hadn't known she possessed. She would not let them take her son. She would not let them win. She looked around wildly, her eyes trying to pierce the oppressive darkness. And then she saw it, a faint, almost imperceptible break in the dense wall of trees to their left, a narrow cleft in the rock face of the hillside they had been climbing. A cave? Or just a shallow overhang? It was impossible to tell in the darkness, but it was their only hope. "Help me, Ben," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, infused with a desperate strength. "We have to get to those rocks." Leaning heavily on Elara, his face pale and beaded with sweat, Ben managed to drag himself a few agonizing feet towards the dark opening in the hillside. Elara, her own body screaming in protest, half carried, half dragged him, her focus narrowed to that single desperate goal. The cleft in the rock was deeper than she had hoped, a narrow, fissure-like cave that receded into the blackness of the hillside. It was damp, cold, and smelled of wet stone and something else, something faintly animalistic, but it offered concealment, a temporary refuge from the storm that was about to break upon them. She helped Ben inside, easing him down onto the cold, uneven floor, his injured legs stretched out awkwardly before him. Samuel, sensing his mother's distress, began to fuss again, his whimpers growing louder. "Shoo, my love," Elara whispered, rocking him gently, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Please, Samuel, please be quiet." The baying of the hounds was almost upon them now, accompanied by the guttural shouts of the villagers, the clanging of metal, the crackle of torches moving through the undergrowth. They could see the flickering orange glow of the torches through the narrow entrance of the cave, casting dancing, demonic shadows on the trees outside. "They're here," Ben whispered, his voice hoarse, his eyes fixed on the cave entrance. He fumbled for his hunting knife, its small blade a pathetic defense against the approaching horde. Elara pressed herself further back into the darkness of the cave, shielding Samuel with her body, her mind racing. There had to be something, some way, and then she remembered the Lavoie journal. Its destruction, its offering to the Old One, had caused chaos, had momentarily broken Lavoie's control. What if the Old One was not just a malevolent entity, but a territorial one? What if it didn't tolerate rivals or intrusions within its domain, especially when its pact had been violated? Its power challenged? It was another insane gamble, a desperate, last-ditch throw of the dice. But what do they have to lose? She looked at Samuel, at his small, innocent face, his unervingly dark eyes, now wide and watchful in the dim light filtering into the cave. He was the key. He was the catalyst. He was the one who had defied Oakhaven's ancient curse. "Ben," she whispered, her voice urgent. "The journal. It made the Old One angry, confused. What if we can use that? What if we can turn Lavoie's own power against her?" Ben stared at her, his brow furrowed in confusion, his face etched with pain. "What are you talking about, Ellie?" Before she could explain, the first of the hounds appeared at the mouth of the cave, a massive, black beast with eyes like burning coals, its lips curled back in a savage snarl, its deep-throated barks echoing in the confined space. It was followed by another, and then another, their forms silhouetted against the flickering torchlight. And then, the villagers began to emerge from the trees, their faces grim, determined, their eyes reflecting the feral glow of the torches they carried. They were armed with crude weapons, pitchforks, axes, heavy clubs. And at their head, her face a mask of cold, implacable fury, was Madame Lavoie. Her earlier fear, her momentary disarray, was gone, replaced by an iron resolve, a chilling certainty. She had come to reclaim what was hers, to restore the ancient order, to exact her terrible vengeance. The weight of Oakhaven's stillness, which had been a prelude to this horror, was about to be shattered by a final, brutal reckoning. Chapter 6. The Village's Watchful Eyes. Madame Lavoie stood at the mouth of the narrow cave, her tall, hooded figure framed by the flickering, demonic glow of the villagers' torches. Her pale eyes, like chips of ice, scanned the dark interior, fixing first on Ben's prone, injured form, then on Elara, who clutched Samuel protectively to her chest. A cold, cruel smile touched Lavoie's lips. "The hunt is over, little fugitives," she rasped, her voice devoid of any emotion save a chilling, triumphant satisfaction. "You have nowhere left to run. Oakhaven always claims its own. The hounds, 3 massive, black beasts with slavering jaws and eyes that glowed with a feral hunger, strained at their leashes, their deep-throated barks echoing in the confined space, eager to be loosed upon their prey. The villagers, a silent, grim-faced mob, pressed in behind their midwife, their crude weapons held ready, their faces illuminated by the torchlight, revealing a disturbing mixture of fear, fanaticism, and a dull, bovine obedience. They were Lavoie's instruments, her extensions, their wills subsumed by hers, by the ancient, insidious power that held Oakhaven in its thrall. "Give me the child," Lavoie commanded, her voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "And perhaps your end will be swift." Ben, despite the searing pain in his ankle, tried to push himself up, his hunting knife held defensively before him. "Stay away from them, Lavoie," he snarled, his voice weak but defiant. "You'll have to kill me first." Lavoie's smile widened. "That can be arranged, little father. Easily arranged." She gestured with a gnarled hand, and two of the villagers, burly men with dead, pitiless eyes, moved forward, their pitchforks glinting in the torchlight. But Elara, her mind racing with a desperate, audacious plan, stepped forward, shielding Ben, her gaze fixed on Madame Lavoie. Samuel, as if sensing the shift in his mother's demeanor, had fallen silent again, his unervingly dark eyes wide and watchful, fixed not on Lavoie, but on some point beyond her, in the depths of the woods from which they had just fled. "You serve the Old One, don't you, Lavoie?" Elara said, her voice surprisingly calm, clear, and carrying in the sudden, tense silence that had fallen, broken only by the growling of the hounds and the crackle of the torches. "You are its priestess, its intermediary. You make the offerings. You keep the pact." Madame Lavoie's eyes narrowed. A flicker of surprise, of unease, crossed her face. "You know nothing, girl," she hissed. "You meddle in things far beyond your feeble comprehension." "Oh, I think I comprehend enough," Elara countered, her voice gaining strength, her gaze unwavering. "I comprehend that the Old One demands its tithe. It demands silence. It demands obedience. And it doesn't like rivals. It doesn't like its power challenged or its territory encroached upon." She took a deep breath, her heart pounding, her gamble laid bare. "And you, Lavoie, you have failed it," the child cried. The silence was broken. The pact was disturbed. A murmur ran through the assembled villagers. Their eyes, which had been fixed on Elara and Ben with a dull, predatory anticipation, now flickered towards their midwife, a dawning unease, a seed of doubt, visible in their faces. Even the hounds seemed to sense the shift in the atmosphere, their growls subsiding into low, uncertain whimpers. Madame Lavoie's face contorted with rage. "Lies!" she shrieked, her voice cracking. "The child is OAKHAVEN'S. The pact holds. The Old One is pleased." "Is it?" Elara challenged, her voice ringing out, bold and defiant. "Is the Old One truly pleased with a midwife who allowed its secrets to be stolen? With a priestess whose offering cried out in defiance?" She looked directly at the villagers, her voice filled with a desperate conviction. "Your Old One, it's a creature of the deep woods, isn't it? A territorial power. And Madame Lavoie, she brought you here, to this place, on the very edge of its domain, armed, noisy, disturbing its slumber, its sanctity. Does that sound like the act of a faithful servant? Or does it sound like sacrilege?" The villagers stirred uneasily, their gazes shifting from Elara to Lavoie, then towards the dark, silent woods that lay beyond the flickering torchlight. The woods that, they all knew, were the sacred, inviolable territory of the Old One. Madame Lavoie, seeing her control over her followers beginning to waver, let out a furious cry. "Enough of this foolishness. Seize them. Take the child." But her command lacked its earlier authority. The villagers hesitated, their crude weapons held less confidently, their eyes filled with a new, superstitious fear, not of Elara and Ben, but of the unseen, ancient power they might be offending, of the wrath of their dark god. And then Samuel, as if on cue, as if understanding his mother's desperate ploy, let out a cry. Not a whimper, not a fuss, but a full-throated, piercing wail, a sound of pure, unadulterated infant rage that echoed through the narrow cave and out into the silent, watchful woods. It was a sound that had not been heard in Oakhaven in generations, a sound that was anathema to its ancient, silent order. The effect was instantaneous and terrifying. From the depths of the woods, from the direction of the Old One's presumed lair, came an answering sound, a low, guttural roar, so profound, so resonant, it seemed to shake the very foundations of the hillside. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated fury, of ancient power disturbed, of territorial integrity violated. The ground beneath their feet trembled. The trees at the edge of the clearing swayed violently, as if struck by an invisible hurricane. The torches in the villagers' hands flickered and died, plunging the scene into a terrifying, disorienting darkness, broken only by the faint, residual glow from the embers. The hounds, yelping in terror, broke free from their handlers and fled, disappearing into the night. The villagers cried out, a collective gasp of fear and confusion, their ranks breaking, their earlier fanaticism dissolving into a primal, superstitious dread. Madame Lavoie alone stood her ground, though her face, in the sudden, eerie gloom, was a mask of horrified disbelief. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It cannot be. The old one, it protects its own. Does it, Lavoie?" Elara's voice cut through the darkness, cold and clear. Or does it punish those who fail it? Those who defile its sanctuary? Those who break its silence? Another roar, closer this time, louder, more terrible, ripped through the night. It was followed by a series of tremendous crashing sounds, as if giant trees were being snapped like twigs, as if something vast, ancient, and unimaginably powerful were moving through the woods. Coming towards them, drawn by the disturbance, by the cries of the child, by the scent of Lavoie's sacrilege. The villagers, their courage utterly shattered, began to scream, to scatter, stumbling over each other in their desperate haste to escape the unseen, approaching horror, to flee back to the relative, perceived safety of Oakhaven. They dropped their weapons, their torches, their loyalty to their midwife forgotten in the face of this primal, overwhelming terror. Madame Lavoie remained frozen, her pale eyes fixed on the darkness of the woods, her face a mixture of terror, defiance, and a dawning, terrible understanding. She had overreached. She had brought the hunt too close to the sacred heart of the Old One's domain. She had allowed the silence to be broken, the pact to be questioned, and now the ancient power she had served, the power she had sought to control, was turning against her. The crashing in the woods grew louder, closer. The air grew heavy, thick with an almost palpable sense of ancient, malevolent power. A rank, musky odor, the scent of the Old One's monstrous familiar, but magnified, intensified, filled the narrow confines of the cave. And then, from the darkness, two enormous, glowing eyes, like molten gold, appeared, fixing on Madame Lavoie with a cold, predatory intensity. They were not the eyes of the hounds. They were something else, something far older, far more terrible. Madame Lavoie let out a single, choked scream, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. She turned, as if to flee, but it was too late. A vast, shadowy form, impossibly large, impossibly ancient, loomed up from the darkness of the woods, its outlines indistinct, its shape constantly shifting, like a nightmare made manifest. It was the guardian of the threshold, the enforcer of the pact, the Old One's monstrous seneschal, and it had come to claim its due. The last thing Elara and Ben saw, before they instinctively recoiled deeper into the protective darkness of the cave, shielding their crying son, was the look of utter, soul-destroying terror on Madame Lavoie's face as the massive, shadowy entity enveloped her, its roar of fury and triumph echoing through the Oakhaven night, a sound that would haunt their dreams for the rest of their lives. The watchful eyes of Oakhaven and the ancient power they served had finally, terribly, turned upon their own. Chapter 7, A Mother's Intuition. The monstrous sounds from outside the cave, the roars of the colossal, shadowy entity, Madame Lavoie's final, choked scream. The panicked shrieks of the fleeing villagers gradually subsided, replaced by an eerie, unnatural silence that was, in its own way, even more terrifying. The rank, musky odor of the Old One's enforcer lingered in the air, a nauseating reminder of the primal horror that had just unfolded. Elara and Ben remained huddled in the deepest recesses of the narrow cave, their bodies pressed together, Samuel clutched tightly between them. He had, miraculously, fallen silent again, his earlier cries giving way to an exhausted, watchful stillness, as if he, too, understood the magnitude of the power that had just been unleashed, the terrible judgment that had been meted out. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the oppressive quiet. Had it gone? Was it safe to move? Or was the creature still out there, waiting, listening, its glowing, golden eyes fixed on the mouth of their fragile sanctuary? Ben, his face pale and grim in the Stygian darkness, slowly, cautiously, raised his head. He listened intently, straining to hear any sound, any indication of lingering danger. But there was nothing, only the faint, distant rustle of leaves, the mournful sigh of the wind in the trees, and the heavy, ragged sound of their own breathing. The air, though still tainted with the faint, lingering scent of the monstrous entity, felt lighter, somehow. The oppressive, malevolent presence that had emanated from Madame Lavoie, and from the unseen power she served, seemed to have lifted, or at least receded. I think it's gone," Ben whispered, his voice hoarse, uncertain. Lavoie, and that thing. He didn't dare to hope. Not yet. Oakhaven had taught him that hope was a dangerous, fragile commodity, easily crushed. They waited, frozen in place for what felt like an eternity, the silence stretching their nerves to the breaking point. Finally, as the first pale, gray light of dawn began to filter into the mouth of the cave, painting the rough stone walls with an ethereal, ghostly glow, Ben made a decision. "We have to see," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "We can't stay here forever." Leaning heavily on a sturdy branch he found near the cave entrance. Using it as a makeshift crutch for his injured ankle, he slowly, painfully pulled himself to his feet. Elara watched him, her eyes wide with apprehension. Samuel clutched protectively in her arms. Ben edged towards the mouth of the cave, his senses on high alert, his hunting knife held ready, though he knew it would be useless against the kind of power they had just witnessed. He peered out into the clearing. The scene that greeted him was one of utter devastation. The small clearing before the cave was a chaotic mess of discarded torches, abandoned weapons, and churned earth, as if a battle had been fought there. Several large trees at the edge of the woods were snapped in two, their massive trunks splintered like matchsticks. Of Madame Lavoie, there was no sign, no body, no blood, nothing. It was as if she had been unmade, erased from existence by the ancient, terrible power she had sought to control. The villagers, too, were gone, presumably having fled back to the dubious safety of Oakhaven, their fanatical loyalty to their midwife shattered by the primal terror they had experienced. The air was still, the woods unervingly quiet, but the oppressive, malevolent atmosphere that had clung to Oakhaven, the sense of an ancient, watchful intelligence, seemed to have dissipated. It was as if a great weight had been lifted from the land. "She's gone," Ben said, his voice filled with a mixture of awe, disbelief, and a profound, weary relief. "Lavoie, she's gone. And that thing, I don't sense it anymore." Elara slowly joined him at the mouth of the cave. Samuel nestled in her arms. She looked out at the scene of devastation, her heart still pounding, but a fragile, tentative hope beginning to flicker within her. Had they done it? Had they actually survived? Had her desperate gamble, her appeal to the Old One's territorial fury, somehow broken the curse of Oakhaven? Samuel stirred in her arms, his unervingly dark eyes opening, blinking slowly in the pale morning light. Elara's breath caught in her throat. His eyes, they were still dark, unnaturally so, but the impenetrable obsidian blackness was receding. Faint, almost imperceptible flecks of deep, stormy blue were visible now, like distant stars emerging from a midnight sky. The change was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. He was still marked, still touched by Oakhaven's shadow. But he was no longer the silent, soulless effigy he had been. He was her son. "We need to get out of these woods," Ben said, his voice firm, pulling Elara from her reverie. "Before anything else changes its mind. Before the villagers regroup. Or before whatever that thing was decides to come back." He was right. Their reprieve, however miraculous, might be temporary, Oakhaven was a place of ancient, unpredictable power, and they had meddled in things they did not fully understand. They had to escape, to put as much distance as possible between themselves and this cursed valley. Using the branch as a crutch, Ben led the way, Elara following close behind, Samuel clutched tightly in her arms. They moved slowly, cautiously, their senses on high alert, but the woods, for the first time since their arrival in Oakhaven, felt neutral. The oppressive, watchful silence had been replaced by a more natural quiet. The sounds of birds beginning to tentatively chirp in the distance, the rustle of small animals in the undergrowth. It was as if the land itself, freed from Lavoie's oppressive influence, was slowly beginning to breathe again. Their progress was agonizingly slow, hampered by Ben's injured ankle and Elara's postpartum weakness, but driven by a desperate hope, by the fragile promise of freedom. They pressed on. They had no map, no clear sense of direction, only a vague, instinctive urge to move west, away from Oakhaven, towards the distant, hazy outline of the mountains that, they prayed, marked the edge of this cursed valley. Hours passed. The sun climbed higher in the sky, its warmth a welcome sensation on their chilled skin. Samuel slept fitfully in Elara's arms, his small face peaceful, his breathing soft and regular. Elara found herself constantly, obsessively, checking his eyes, searching for any further sign of change, any further lightening of their unnatural darkness. The flecks of blue were still there, perhaps a little more pronounced, a little more hopeful. Sometime in the late afternoon, when they were on the verge of collapse, their strength utterly depleted, they stumbled upon it. An old, overgrown logging trail, barely discernible beneath a carpet of fallen leaves and encroaching vegetation, but a trail nonetheless. It was faint, almost erased by time and neglect, but it led, unmistakably, west towards the mountains. A surge of adrenaline, of renewed hope, coursed through Elara and Ben. This was it, their way out, their escape route from the nightmare of Oakhaven. They followed the trail with a renewed, desperate energy, their steps, though still slow and painful, now imbued with a sense of purpose, of direction. The woods around them seemed to be thinning, the trees less ancient, less oppressive. The air felt cleaner, lighter, free of the cloying, sweet, herbal scent that had been the olfactory signature of Madame Lavoie and her dark master. As dusk began to settle, casting long, purple shadows across the landscape, they reached the crest of a small rise. And there, spread out before them, in the hazy distance, they saw it the faint, twinkling lights of a town nestled in the foothills of the mountains. Hollowell, civilization, safety. Tears streamed down Elara's face, tears of relief, of exhaustion, of a joy so profound it was almost painful. Ben leaned heavily on his makeshift crutch, his face pale and drawn, but his eyes shining with a fierce, triumphant light. They had done it. They had survived Oakhaven. They had faced down its ancient evil, its terrifying midwife, and they had escaped with their lives and with their son. As they began their slow, painful descent towards the distant lights, Elara looked down at Samuel, nestled in her arms. His eyes were open, blinking slowly in the fading light, and in their depths, the flecks of blue were more distinct now, a clear, undeniable sign of his slow, miraculous healing. He was still marked, perhaps he always would be, a child born under Lavoie's shadow, a child of Oakhaven's cursed legacy. But he was also a child of defiance, a child of hope, a testament to a mother's fierce, unyielding intuition and a father's desperate courage. The weight of Oakhaven's stillness was finally, blessedly, beginning to lift. But the silence and the secrets of that cursed valley, Elara knew, would haunt them and their son for the rest of their days. Chapter 8. Secrets in the Midwife's Cottage. The escape from Oakhaven, though a desperate, terrifying ordeal, had felt like a victory. The sight of Hollowell's distant lights, the promise of civilization and safety, had been a beacon of hope in the oppressive darkness. But the reality of their situation once they finally stumbled, exhausted and battered, into the outskirts of the town, was far more complicated. They were a ragged, traumatized couple with a newborn baby and a story so outlandish, so horrifying, it bordered on the unbelievable. Ben's ankle was badly swollen, clearly broken, and Elara was weak, anemic, still recovering from the ordeal of childbirth in the wilderness. Samuel, though his eyes continued their slow, miraculous lightning, was still unnervingly quiet for a newborn, his gaze too knowing, too ancient for his tender age. They found temporary refuge in a small, run-down motel on the edge of Hollowell, paying for a room with the last of their cash. The sterile, impersonal surroundings, the flickering fluorescent lights, the distant sound of traffic. It was a jarring contrast to the oppressive, organic silence of Oakhaven, yet it felt, in its own way, like a sanctuary. Ben, his face pale with pain, managed to fashion a crude splint for his ankle. But it was clear he needed proper medical attention. Elara, after cleaning herself and Samuel as best she could in the tiny, rust-stained bathroom, collapsed onto the sagging bed, her body aching, her mind still reeling from the horrors they had endured. Sleep, when it finally came, was shallow, plagued by nightmares of glowing golden eyes, of shadowy, shifting forms, and of Madame Lavoie's final, terrifying scream. The next morning, their fragile sense of safety was shattered by a harsh knock on the motel room door. It was a local sheriff's deputy, a stout, middle-aged man with a skeptical, world-weary expression. Someone, perhaps the motel owner, had reported their disheveled appearance, their lack of luggage, and their general air of desperation. The deputy listened, with a mixture of disbelief and thinly veiled suspicion, as Ben, choosing his words carefully, tried to explain their presence in Hollowell, omitting the more fantastical, unbelievable elements of their story. He spoke of getting lost in the woods, of Elara going into premature labor, of his own injury. He made no mention of Oakhaven, of Madame Lavoie, of silent, black-eyed children, or of ancient, malevolent entities. It sounded weak, unconvincing even to his own ears. The deputy, clearly unconvinced, insisted on taking them to the local hospital, partly for Ben's ankle and Elara's postpartum checkup, but mostly, Elara suspected, to have them evaluated by social services. The thought of having Samuel taken from them, of being deemed unfit, unstable parents, filled her with a fresh wave of terror. At the hospital, Ben's ankle was set and put in a cast. Elara was examined by a kind but concerned doctor who noted her exhaustion, her anemia, and her general state of agitation. Samuel, too, was checked over. The pediatrician, a young, brisk woman, frowned at the unusual darkness of his eyes, but attributed it to a rare but benign pigmentation anomaly. She noted his quietness, his lack of crying, but seemed more concerned with his weight and feeding than with any potential underlying psychological or supernatural issues. "He's a very calm baby," she commented, her pen hovering over her notes, her gaze lingering on Samuel's unnervingly still face. Then came the interview with the social worker, a stern, no-nonsense woman named Mrs. Albright. She listened with a practiced, professional skepticism to their carefully edited story. She asked pointed questions about their plans, their finances, their support system. Elara and Ben, with no credible answers, no family nearby, no jobs, and no fixed address, felt their carefully constructed facade begin to crumble. Mrs. Albright's expression grew increasingly concerned. She spoke of child welfare, of temporary foster care, of ensuring the baby's safety and well-being. Elara's heart sank. They had escaped the horrors of Oakhaven, only to potentially lose their son to the well-meaning but inflexible bureaucracy of the outside world. Desperate, Ben played their last, desperate card. He told Mrs. Albright about the Lavoie journal. Not the whole truth, not the terrifying, unbelievable parts about the old one and the monstrous entity in the woods, but enough to pique her interest, to plant a seed of doubt, to suggest that there was more to their story than just a couple lost in the woods. He spoke of a remote, isolated community of strange, outdated birthing practices, of a powerful, controlling midwife named Madame Lavoie, and of a journal that detailed generations of questionable, perhaps even illegal, activities. He presented it as a potential case of medical malpractice, of a cult-like community endangering its children, hinting at a darker, hidden truth without explicitly stating its supernatural nature. Mrs. Albright, to their surprise, listened intently. The name Oakhaven, though not widely known, apparently carried certain connotations in the surrounding counties. Whispers of an insular, secretive community, of strange disappearances, of people who went in but never came out, had circulated for years, dismissed as local folklore as baseless rumors. But Ben's story, and his mention of a journal, a tangible piece of evidence, however lost, seemed to strike a chord. She made a few discreet phone calls. She spoke in low, hushed tones, her expression growing increasingly grim. When she returned, her demeanor towards Elara and Ben had subtly shifted. The suspicion was still there, but it was now tinged with a reluctant curiosity, a professional concern that went beyond their immediate parental fitness. "This Madame Lavoie," she said, her gaze sharp, analytical. "And this journal, if what you're implying is true, Mr. Thorne, this could be a very serious matter." She agreed, for now, not to separate them from Samuel. She arranged for them to stay at a local women's shelter, a temporary measure while she made some inquiries. It was not ideal, but it was a reprieve. They were still together. They still had their son. But the shadow of Oakhaven, Elara knew, had followed them, even here, into the seemingly safe, rational world beyond its cursed borders. The secrets of Madame Lavoie's cottage, though its physical manifestation was now presumably just a pile of rubble or an empty clearing in the woods, still cast a long, dark shadow. And the most terrifying secret of all, the true nature of the Old One and the extent of its ancient, enduring power, remained locked away, a chilling enigma that Oakhaven would guard, perhaps for eternity. The Lavoie journal was gone, but its contents, the horrifying truth of Oakhaven's pact, were seared into their memories, a burden they would carry forever. And the question that haunted Elara's waking hours and her nightmares was whether the Old One, deprived of its priestess, deprived of its tithe, would remain quiescent, or whether its ancient hunger, its insatiable need, would eventually drive it to seek them out, to reclaim the child that had defied its ancient, silent order. The secrets of the midwife's cottage were more than just entries in a forgotten journal. They were a living, breathing horror, and its tendrils, Elara feared, might still be reaching for them, even now. Chapter 9. The Stirring of Old Rites. Life in the Hollowell Women's Shelter was a strange, disorienting limbo, surrounded by other bruised and broken lives. Elara and Ben felt both a sense of camaraderie and a profound, isolating alienation. Their trauma, the specific, unutterable nature of the horrors they had endured in Oakhaven, set them apart. A secret they could share with no one. They were the couple who got lost in the woods, the ones with the quiet, watchful baby whose eyes were still just a little too dark, a little too knowing. Ben's ankle healed slowly, his immobility a constant frustration. Elara, though physically recovering from childbirth, wrestled with a deep, pervasive anxiety, starting at every unexpected sound. Her sleep plagued by nightmares of Madame Lavoie and the monstrous entity in the woods. Samuel, their silent, enigmatic son, was their only anchor, his gradual, almost imperceptible return to a semblance of normalcy, their only source of fragile hope. His eyes, day by day, continued their slow transformation, the flecks of stormy blue becoming more pronounced, the unnatural blackness receding like a fading bruise. He even began to make small, tentative cooing sounds, a development that filled Elara with an almost painful joy. Mrs. Albright, the social worker, true to her word, made inquiries. She was discreet, professional, but Elara sensed a growing, almost obsessive interest in their case. In the veiled hints they had dropped about Oakhaven and Madame Lavoie, she visited them regularly at the shelter, her questions becoming more pointed, more probing. She spoke of historical patterns of isolation in certain remote communities, of folk beliefs and unorthodox practices. She never used words like cult or supernatural, but the implication hung heavy in the air. Elara and Ben remained guarded, terrified of revealing too much, of sounding insane, of losing Samuel. They clung to their edited version of events, emphasizing the potential medical malpractice, the lack of proper care, the strange, controlling influence of the midwife. They never spoke of the old one, of the black-eyed children, of the terrifying, shadowy creature that had consumed Madame Lavoie. Those horrors were too vast, too unbelievable for this rational, ordered world. Then, one afternoon, Mrs. Albright arrived at the shelter with a grim, troubled expression. She had news, disturbing news. "I spoke with the state police," she said, her voice low, her gaze fixed on Elara and Ben, "and with the county historian. Oakhaven, it has a history, a strange one. There are old records from the 19th century, even earlier, that speak of unusual birth rates, of a high infant mortality, though the deaths were often unrecorded or attributed to natural causes. And there are recurring mentions of a Lavoie family, always women, always involved in midwifery, always influential." Elara and Ben exchanged a knowing, fearful glance. The Lavoie Journal. Its contents were not mere fantasy, not the ramblings of a madwoman. They were rooted in a dark, verifiable history. "And then there's this," Mrs. Albright continued, pulling a faded, sepia-toned photograph from a briefcase. It was a picture of a group of stern-faced, unsmiling people, dressed in archaic, homespun clothing, standing before a rustic, unadorned building that Elara and Ben recognized instantly. The church in Oakhaven Square, the one with the missing cross. "This was taken in the late 1800s, Mrs. Albright said. It's labeled the Oakhaven Congregation. But the historian I spoke to, he said they weren't a recognized religious group. They were something else, something older, something secretive. The photograph, the historical records, Ben's carefully edited testimony. It was enough." Mrs. Albright, armed with a growing unease and a sense of professional obligation, managed to convince the local authorities to investigate. A team of state troopers, accompanied by a county health inspector and a reluctant, skeptical child services investigator, was dispatched to Oakhaven. Elara and Ben waited, their anxiety a palpable, suffocating presence, for news of what they would find. Part of Elara prayed they would find nothing, that Oakhaven had simply vanished, swallowed by the woods, its horrors erased. Another, darker part of her, the part that still felt the chilling touch of Madame Lavoie's power, feared what might happen if the outside world intruded too deeply, too forcefully, into Oakhaven's ancient, slumbering darkness. The news, when it finally came, was anticlimactic and deeply unsettling. The investigative team returned from Oakhaven confused, frustrated, and empty-handed. The village was there, just as Elara and Ben had described it. Remote, isolated, its inhabitants silent, watchful, and deeply uncooperative. But there was no sign of Madame Lavoie. The villagers claimed she had gone away, returned to the old paths, their explanations vague, evasive, tinged with a strange, almost fearful reverence. Her cottage, when the investigators finally located it deep in the woods, was empty, abandoned, swept clean of any personal belongings, any incriminating evidence. It was as if she had simply evaporated. The forgotten chapel, the one where Ben had found the journal, could not be located. The woods, the villagers claimed, were deceptive, prone to changing. There were no black-eyed children to be found. The few infants the investigators saw were normal, quiet, perhaps a little too pale, but their eyes were ordinary, their behavior unremarkable. The terrifying, shadowy entity, The Old One's monstrous seneschal remained unseen, its existence relegated to the realm of nightmare and unbelievable folklore. Oakhaven, it seemed, had closed ranks. It had retreated into its ancient, impenetrable shell, its secrets guarded, its horrors veiled. The investigators found no evidence of wrongdoing, no proof of neglect or abuse, nothing to substantiate Elara and Ben's carefully edited, yet still outlandish claims. They left Oakhaven baffled, their report inconclusive, tinged with a reluctant admission that the village was strange, unsettling, but ultimately beyond the reach of their authority. Their understanding. For Elara and Ben, the news was both a relief and a profound disappointment. Oakhaven's evil remained, unpunished, unchecked, but at least for now they were safe. Mrs. Albright, though clearly still troubled, had no grounds to detain them further. They were free to go. They left Hollowell a few days later with a little money scraped together from a local church charity, and a profound sense of weariness, of being forever marked by their ordeal. They found a small, cheap apartment in a town several states away, a place as far removed from the brooding forests and oppressive silences of Oakhaven as they could manage. They tried to build a new life, to forget, to heal. Ben found work as a handyman. Elara devoted herself to Samuel, marveling at his slow, steady progress, at the way the stormy blue of his eyes gradually, almost completely, eclipsed the last vestiges of Oakhaven's unnatural darkness. He began to smile, to gurgle, to reach for her with his tiny hands. He was, in almost every way, a normal, healthy baby. Almost. But Oakhaven and its ancient, slumbering power had a long memory, and its roots, as Madame Lavoie had warned, ran deep. Months later, as the first anniversary of their escape approached, as the leaves began to turn and the nights grew longer, a subtle, disquieting change began to creep into their new, fragile peace. Elara started having nightmares again, vivid, terrifying dreams of Oakhaven, of Madame Lavoie's pale, knowing eyes, of the monstrous, shadowy entity in the woods. She would wake up in a cold sweat, her heart pounding, the faint, sweet, herbal scent of Lavoie's presence lingering in the air, a phantom aroma that only she could detect. Samuel, too, became restless, his sleep disturbed, his quietness taking on a new, unsettling quality, a return to that unnerving, watchful stillness that had characterized his first days of life. His eyes, though still predominantly blue, sometimes seemed to darken, to hold a fleeting, shadowy depth that reminded Elara, with a fresh wave of terror, of the Oakhaven'sCurse. And then, the whispers started. Not real whispers, not at first, but a sense of them, a feeling of being watched, of unseen presences just beyond the periphery of her vision. She would catch fleeting glimpses of figures in dark, hooded robes, standing at the edge of her sight, disappearing when she turned to look directly. She would hear faint, rhythmic chanting, so low it was almost subliminal, carried on the night wind. She tried to dismiss it as stress, as trauma, as her imagination playing tricks on her. But the feeling persisted, grew stronger, more insistent. Oakhaven was stirring. Its ancient rites, its forgotten traditions, were being reawakened. And Elara, with a chilling, dawning certainty, knew that the Old One, deprived of its priestess, deprived of its tithe, was growing restless, its ancient hunger unappeased. And it was reaching out, its tendrils extending far beyond the cursed valley, searching for the child that had defied its ancient, silent order, for the mother who had broken its pact. The stirring of old rites was beginning, and Oakhaven, Elara feared, was not yet finished with them. Chapter 10. The Growing Darkness. The unsettling occurrences escalated, slowly at first, then with a terrifying, undeniable momentum. The phantom whispers Elara heard became more distinct. No longer just a feeling, but actual, sibilant murmurs that seemed to emanate from the shadows of their small apartment, speaking in a language she didn't understand, yet which filled her with a primal dread. The fleeting glimpses of hooded figures became more frequent, more brazen, sometimes lingering just long enough for her to see the pale. Impassive faces beneath the hoods, faces that reminded her, with a sickening lurch of her stomach, of the silent, watchful villagers of Oakhaven. Ben, though he tried to be rational, to find logical explanations, began to experience them too. He would hear the faint, rhythmic chanting on his way home from work, see shadowy figures lurking in alleyways, feel the oppressive weight of unseen eyes following him. The sweet, herbal scent of Madame Lavoie, once confined to Elara's nightmares, now occasionally, inexplicably, permeated their apartment. A chilling olfactory reminder of Oakhaven's enduring, insidious reach. Samuel, their son, was the most profoundly affected. His progress, which had been so heartening, so filled with promise, began to reverse. The light in his eyes, the beautiful, stormy blue that had fought so hard to eclipse the Oakhaven darkness, started to recede, replaced once more by that unnerving, shadowy depth. His tentative coos and gurgles ceased. His newfound smiles vanished. He returned to that unnerving, preternatural stillness, his gaze fixed on some unseen point, his small face a mask of ancient, watchful solemnity. He rarely slept, his dark eyes open, unblinking, even in the dead of night, as if he were communing with the unseen forces that were once again encroaching upon their lives. Elara would watch him, her heart aching with a mixture of love, fear, and a growing, desperate anger. Oakhaven was reclaiming him, slowly, inexorably, drawing him back into its silent, cursed embrace. The darkness that had once been confined to the cursed valley of Oakhaven was now seeping into their new life, poisoning their fragile peace, turning their sanctuary into a besieged outpost. They felt isolated, trapped, their terror a secret they could share with no one. Who would believe them? Who could help them against an enemy that was not entirely of this world, an ancient, insidious power that operated beyond the reach of reason, beyond the scope of conventional understanding? Ben, driven by a desperate need to protect his family, to fight back against this encroaching horror, began to research. He spent hours at the local library, poring over dusty tomes on folklore, on ancient religions, on obscure, forgotten cults. He searched the internet, delving into the darkest corners of the web, looking for any information, any clue that might help them understand the nature of the Old One, the source of Oakhaven's power, the meaning of its dark pact. He found fragments, whispers, oblique references in forgotten texts, and obscure online forums. Tales of ancient chthonic deities, earth gods who demanded blood sacrifice, who offered prosperity in exchange for fealty, for the first fruits of the harvest, for the tithe of new life. Stories of isolated communities, bound by dark covenants, their traditions passed down through generations, their secrets guarded by powerful, often female, intermediaries, priestesses, oracles, midwives. The Lavoie lineage. It all began to coalesce into a terrifying, coherent picture. The Old One was not just a local Oakhaven legend. It was a manifestation of something far older, far more widespread, a primal, elemental force that had been worshipped and feared since the dawn of time. And Oakhaven, with its generations of silent, black-eyed children, was one of its last, most devoted strongholds. But knowledge, Ben discovered, was not power. It was a burden, a confirmation of their terrifying insignificance in the face of such ancient, implacable evil. There were no easy answers, no magic bullets, no simple rituals to ward off the encroaching darkness. The text spoke of appeasement, of sacrifice, of an endless cycle of supplication and fear. They spoke of the resilience of these ancient cults, their ability to survive, to adapt, to endure, even in the face of modernity, of skepticism, of the encroaching outside world. Oakhaven had weathered the investigators' scrutiny, had closed ranks, had retreated into its shadows. And now it was reaching out, its tendrils extending, seeking to reclaim what it considered its own. The manifestations grew bolder, more terrifying. One night, Elara awoke to find a hooded figure standing at the foot of their bed, its face obscured by shadow, its presence radiating an icy, malevolent cold. She screamed, and the figure vanished, but the terror lingered, a palpable entity in the room. Another time, Ben returned home from work to find strange, spidery sigils, chillingly similar to the ones he had seen in the forgotten chapel, drawn in dust on their apartment door. They would hear scratching sounds from within the walls, soft, rhythmic tapping on the windows, as if something were trying to get in, to gain access to their sanctuary, to their son. Samuel, during these episodes, would become agitated, his small body tense, his dark eyes fixed on the source of the disturbance, a low, guttural sound, almost a growl, emanating from his tiny chest. It was as if he were attuned to the encroaching darkness, as if some part of him, the part that still belonged to Oakhaven, were responding to its call. They were living on a knife edge, their nerves frayed, their sanity stretched to the breaking point. They felt like prisoners in their own home, besieged by an unseen, relentless enemy. The outside world, with its mundane concerns, its oblivious normalcy, seemed a distant, unattainable dream. They were alone, trapped in a nightmare that only they could see, a horror that was slowly, inexorably consuming them. The growing darkness was no longer just a metaphor. It was a tangible, encroaching reality. And Elara knew, with a chilling, maternal certainty, that it was coming for Samuel. The old one was hungry. Its priestess was gone. Its tithe was overdue. And her son, the child who had cried, the child who had broken the silence, was the focus of its ancient, insatiable hunger. The stirring of old rites was becoming a terrifying, inescapable crescendo, and the final, terrible reckoning, Elara feared, was drawing ever closer. Oakhaven's shadow had found them, and this time, there might be no escape. Chapter 11, The Unspeakable Truth. The breaking point came on a cold, rain-lashed November night, nearly a year after their escape from Oakhaven. The ominous phenomena had reached a terrifying crescendo. The shadowy figures were no longer fleeting glimpses, but lingered, their forms more substantial, their pale, Oakhaven faces clearly visible, their eyes holding that same unnerving, watchful emptiness. The scratching and tapping sounds were incessant, a maddening, relentless assault on their nerves. The sweet, herbal scent of Madame Lavoie permeated their small apartment, so strong it was almost suffocating, a constant, chilling reminder of her enduring, malevolent influence. Even from beyond the grave, or whatever unholy state she now inhabited, Samuel was inconsolable. He no longer slept, his small body racked with tremors, his dark eyes wide with a terror that mirrored his parents'. He whimpered constantly, a low, keening sound that tore at Elara's heart, his gaze darting frantically around the room, as if tracking the movement of unseen, terrifying entities. The last vestiges of blue in his eyes had vanished, consumed once more by that impenetrable Oakhaven blackness. Ben, his face gaunt, his eyes hollowed out by sleeplessness and despair, finally confronted the unbearable truth that he had been trying so desperately to deny. "It's not just Lavoie," he said, his voice raspy, his gaze fixed on a rain-streaked window, beyond which the shadowy figures seemed to be gathering, their forms barely distinguishable from the swirling mist and darkness. "It's not just the villagers or her lingering influence. It's him, the old one. He's reaching for Samuel." Directly, he turned to Elara, his eyes filled with a terrible, dawning understanding. A culmination of all his research, all his desperate attempts to make sense of the horrors that pursued them. The journal wasn't just a record, Ellie. It was a conduit, a link. And Lavoie, she wasn't just a priestess. She was a vessel, a channel for his power. When she died, when that thing in the woods consumed her, that link was broken, or at least weakened. Elara stared at him, her blood running cold, a horrifying premonition gripping her. "What are you saying, Ben?" "The children," he continued, his voice barely a whisper, as if afraid to give voice to the monstrous thought. "The silent, black-eyed children, they weren't just offerings, Ellie. They weren't just a tithe. They were part of him, pieces of him, or perhaps his offspring, his way of propagating himself, of spreading his influence, his consciousness into the world. And Lavoie, she was the one who facilitated it, the midwife, the one who birthed them into his image." Elara gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, a wave of nausea washing over her. The implications were grotesque, unthinkable. Her son, Samuel, he wasn't just marked by Oakhaven. He was... But he cried. She choked out, her voice trembling. He defied it. The blackness in his eyes, it receded. "Yes," Ben said, his gaze intense, desperate. "He fought it. You fought it. We disrupted the ritual, the birthing process. The fall, the shock. It broke the initial connection, or at least weakened it. But the seed was already planted, Ellie. The taint was already there. And the old one, it wants him back. It needs him. Perhaps, without Lavoie, without a direct conduit. It can't create more, like him. Samuel, he might be its last hope, its last chance to endure." The unspeakable truth hung in the air between them, heavy, suffocating, more terrifying than any ghost, any monster, any conventional horror they could have imagined. Their son was not just a victim. He was a key, a vital piece in an ancient cosmic struggle, a vessel coveted by an entity of unimaginable age and power. This was not just about appeasement, about sacrifice. This was about possession, about assimilation, about Samuel becoming another silent, black-eyed child of the old one. A low, guttural growl emanated from Samuel's small chest. He arched his back, his tiny fists clenched, his black eyes fixed on the ceiling, as if staring at something vast and terrible that only he could perceive. The room grew colder, the shadows deeper, the sweet, herbal scent of Lavoie almost overpowering. The scratching and tapping sounds intensified, coming from all around them, as if the apartment itself were under siege. "It's happening now, isn't it?" Elara whispered, her voice filled with a chilling, maternal certainty. "He's trying to take him. Now." Ben nodded, his face a mask of grim despair. He had no weapons, no rituals, no defenses against the power of this magnitude. They were out of time, out of options. But Elara, her eyes blazing with a fierce, protective fury, refused to surrender. "No," she said, her voice low. "Dangerous. He's my son. Not it." She looked at Samuel, at his small, tormented face, at the ancient, alien intelligence that seemed to be looking out from behind his black eyes. And in that moment, she knew what she had to do. It was a desperate, unthinkable act, a choice no mother should ever have to make. But it was the only way to save him, the only way to sever the connection, to break the Oakhaven curse once and for all. "Ben," she said, her voice surprisingly calm, her gaze fixed on her son. "There's only one way to free him. To truly free him. We have to disrupt the vessel. We have to wound the connection." Ben stared at her, his eyes wide with a dawning, horrified understanding. "Ellie, no, you can't mean. He's not just being influenced anymore, Ben," Elara said, her voice trembling but firm. "He's being changed, from inside out. If we don't do something, he'll become one of them. Forever. Another silent, black-eyed child, lost to us, lost to himself. Another piece of that thing." She looked at Ben, her eyes pleading for him to understand, to share the terrible burden of this unbearable choice. The journal said the old one fears true destruction, true loss, not just disruption, but finality. If the vessel is damaged, perhaps the connection will be permanently severed. Perhaps it will be forced to let him go. The unspoken horror of her words hung in the air. To save Samuel from becoming a monster, they might have to harm him, to inflict a wound so profound, so fundamental, that the old one would recoil, would abandon its claim. It was a monstrous, desperate gamble, a choice between two unimaginable horrors. But as Elara looked at her son, at the ancient, alien darkness that was slowly, inexorably consuming him, she knew, with a chilling, soul-deep certainty, that it was the only choice they had left. The unspeakable truth of Oakhaven's legacy had led them to an even more unspeakable decision, and the price of Samuel's freedom, she now realized, might be a wound that would never truly heal. Chapter 12. The Eve of Whispers. The wind howled outside their besieged apartment, the rain lashing against the windows like angry fists. Inside, the air was thick with an almost palpable malevolence. The sweet, herbal scent of Lavoie mingling with a colder, more ancient aroma. The smell of damp earth, of decay, of something vast and chthonic that was pressing in on them. Seeking to reclaim its due, Samuel writhed in Elara's arms, his small body tense, his black eyes wide and unfocused, fixed on some unseen horror that only he could perceive. The low, guttural growl emanating from his chest grew stronger, more resonant, a sound that was not entirely his own. The shadowy figures outside the window pressed closer, their pale, Oakhaven faces contorted in expressions of eager, hungry anticipation. They were waiting for the old one to complete its terrible work, waiting for Samuel to succumb, to become one of them. Ben stared at Elara, his face a mask of anguish, his mind reeling from the unbearable choice she had presented. "Harm him, Ellie," he whispered, his voice choked with disbelief and horror. "Our own son? There has to be another way. Is there, Ben?" Elara's voice was raw, her eyes blazing with a desperate, tortured light. "Look at him. He's slipping away. That thing, it's devouring him from the inside out. If we don't do something, he'll be lost to us forever. He'll be like them." She gestured towards the window, towards the silent, watchful figures, their forms now terrifyingly distinct against the storm-lashed glass. "This isn't a choice between harming him and not harming him, Ben. It's a choice between a wound that might heal, a chance, however slim, at a life, and an eternity as a soulless puppet, a vessel for that abomination." The scratching and tapping sounds from within the walls intensified, becoming a frantic, rhythmic scrabbling, as if unseen claws were trying to tear their way into the room. The lights flickered, dimmed, then went out, plunging them into a terrifying, disorienting darkness, broken only by the faint, eerie glow that seemed to emanate from Samuel's black eyes. "It's now or never, Ben," Elara said, her voice tight with a desperate urgency. "We have to act. Now." She looked around the darkened room, her mind racing, searching for something, anything, that could serve her terrible purpose. Her gaze fell upon a small, antique silver letter opener that lay on a nearby table, a relic from a previous tenant, forgotten, unassuming. Silver. The old legends, the forgotten texts Ben had been reading, they often spoke of silver as a ward against evil, a metal that could harm creatures of darkness, disrupt their power. It was a flimsy hope, a desperate folklore gamble, but it was all she had. With trembling hands, she picked up the letter opener, its cool, metallic surface a stark contrast to the feverish heat of her skin. Ben watched her, his face a mixture of horror, disbelief, and a dawning, terrible understanding. He knew, in that moment, that she was right. There was no other way. This was not a battle they could win with conventional weapons, with reason, with appeals to mercy. This was a primal struggle, a war for their son's soul, and it demanded a primal, desperate act. Samuel let out a piercing shriek, a sound that was not entirely human, his small body arching, his black eyes glowing with an almost unbearable intensity. The shadowy figures outside the window pressed closer, their forms beginning to distort, to elongate, as if the veil between worlds were thinning, as if the old one itself were attempting to manifest, to physically reclaim its errant offspring. "Hold him, Ben," Elara commanded, her voice surprisingly steady, infused with a chilling, almost preternatural calm. "Hold him tight, and don't look. Ben, his face ashen, his eyes filled with an agony that mirrored her own, gently took Samuel from her arms. The baby, or the thing that was consuming the baby, fought against him, its small body possessed of an unnatural strength, its guttural growls filling the darkened room. Ben held him firm, his heart breaking with every struggled breath, every tormented whimper. He turned his face away, unable to watch, tears streaming down his cheeks, a silent, choked sob escaping his lips. Elara approached her son, the silver letter opener held tightly in her trembling hand. She looked down at his small, contorted face, at the black, glowing eyes that held no recognition, no love. Only the cold, alien intelligence of the Old One. "I'm sorry, my love," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Forgive me." And then, with a strength born of a mother's desperate, unyielding love, she did it. She pressed the tip of the silver letter opener, not deep, not to kill, but to mark, to wound, to sever against the soft, vulnerable skin of Samuel's tiny palm. A place where, in some arcane, forgotten lore, the lines of life and fate were said to converge. Samuel let out a sound that was not a cry, not a shriek, but a roar of vast, ancient, elemental roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. A sound that was not his own, but that of the Old One itself. A sound of unimaginable pain, of outrage, of power disrupted, of a connection violently, brutally severed. The shadowy figures at the window recoiled, their forms flickering, dissolving, as if struck by an invisible force. The scratching and tapping sounds ceased. The sweet, herbal scent of Lavoie, and the colder, more ancient aroma of the Old One, vanished, replaced by the clean, sharp scent of the storm. The oppressive, malevolent presence that had filled the room lifted, dissipated, gone as suddenly as it had arrived. In the ensuing silence, broken only by the howl of the wind and the relentless drumming of the rain, Samuel went limp in Ben's arms. His black eyes, which had been glowing with an unholy light, dimmed, faded. The darkness receding, replaced, once more, by that faint, fragile, stormy blue. A thin trickle of blood, dark against his pale skin, welled from the small, precise wound on his palm. He was still, unervingly still, his breathing shallow, almost imperceptible. For a terrifying moment, Elara thought she had killed him, that her desperate, monstrous act had destroyed not just the connection, but the child himself. But then, he let out a small, weak, unmistakably human whimper, followed by another, and then a cry, a fragile, exhausted, but entirely normal baby's cry. Tears streamed down Elara's face as she gently took her son from Ben's trembling arms, cradling him close, rocking him, murmuring words of love, of apology, of a grief so profound it threatened to consume her. Ben, his face buried in his hands, sobbed uncontrollably, the unbearable tension, the accumulated horror, finally breaking through his stoic facade. The eve of whispers, the night when Oakhaven's ancient power had reached its terrifying crescendo, had ended not in submission, not in sacrifice, but in an act of desperate maternal defiance, a wound inflicted in love, a severing that was also, paradoxically, a reclaiming. They had faced the unspeakable truth of Oakhaven, and they had responded with an equally unspeakable act. Samuel was alive. He was for now free, but the cost, Elara knew, was a scar that would forever mark them all, a visible, tangible reminder of the darkness they had confronted, the price they had paid for their son's soul. The storm outside raged on, mirroring the tempest in their hearts, but within the small, darkened apartment, a fragile, exhausted peace had descended. The whispers had ceased. The shadows had retreated. Oakhaven, for now, had been silenced, but the echoes of its ancient, terrible rites, Elara knew, would linger forever. Chapter 13, A Desperate Defiance. The immediate aftermath of that terrible night was a blur of exhaustion, grief, and a fragile, The storm outside eventually subsided, leaving behind a world washed clean, the air crisp and cold. Inside their small apartment, the oppressive, malevolent presence was gone, replaced by a profound, almost unnerving stillness. Samuel slept a deep, exhausted sleep, his small face peaceful, his breathing soft and regular. The tiny, silver-inflicted wound on his palm, cleaned and bandaged by Elara with trembling hands, was a stark, unavoidable reminder of the desperate act that had bought them this reprieve. His eyes, when he briefly stirred, were a clear, untroubled blue. The last vestiges of Oakhaven's unnatural darkness seemingly banished, at least for now. Elara and Ben moved like ghosts, their bodies aching, their minds numb, their emotions raw and exposed. They spoke little, the horror of what they had endured, the magnitude of the choice they had made, too vast, too profound for words. There was no triumph in their survival, only a deep, soul-wearying sadness and a lingering, unshakable fear. Had they truly severed the connection? Or had they merely wounded it? Had they bought Samuel a lifetime of freedom? Or just a temporary respite from the old one's insatiable hunger? The questions haunted them, unspoken but ever-present, a shadow that lay heavy on their fragile peace. In the days that followed, a semblance of normalcy, however tenuous, began to return. The shadowy figures did not reappear. The whispers and scratching sounds ceased. The cloying, sweet scent of Lavoie was gone. Samuel, though still quieter than most babies his age, began to thrive. He gained weight, his smiles became more frequent, his coos and gurgles more confident. The wound on his palm healed, leaving behind a small, silvery scar, a permanent, visible testament to his ordeal, to his parents' desperate, defiant love. Elara found herself obsessively watching him, searching for any sign, any flicker of returning darkness in his eyes, but they remained a clear, steady blue. He was, to all outward appearances, a normal, healthy child. Yet, the shadow of Oakhaven and the unspeakable truth of its ancient, enduring power had changed them irrevocably. They were no longer the same people who had sought a peaceful refuge in that cursed valley. They had looked into the abyss, had confronted a horror that defied reason, that transcended the boundaries of the known world. And they had been forced to make a choice that would forever haunt their conscience, a choice that blurred the lines between love and violence, between salvation and sacrifice. They could not forget. They could not unsee. They could not unknow. Ben, though relieved by Samuel's apparent recovery, became withdrawn, consumed by a quiet, brooding intensity. He continued his research, no longer searching for answers or solutions, but for understanding, for context, for some way to reconcile the horrors they had experienced with the mundane, indifferent reality of the world around them. He delved deeper into the forgotten lore of ancient cults, of chthonic deities, of blood pacts and territorial spirits. He found recurring themes of balance, of appeasement, of the delicate, often terrifying relationship between humanity and the primal, elemental forces that govern the natural world. The Old One, he began to suspect, was not merely a malevolent entity, but a fundamental part of Oakhaven's existence, its power intertwined with the very fabric of the land. Its hunger a reflection of the Earth's own insatiable need for renewal, for sacrifice. Madame Lavoie and her Lavoie ancestors had not just been priestesses, they had been regulators, intermediaries, maintaining a fragile, dangerous equilibrium between the village and the ancient power it served. Their destruction of Lavoie, their defiance of the pact, had not necessarily vanquished the evil. It had merely disrupted the balance. In nature, Ben knew, abhorred a vacuum. Elara, too, was changed. Her maternal instincts, always strong, had been forged in the crucible of unimaginable terror, honed into a fierce, unwavering protectiveness. She watched over Samuel with a vigilant, almost obsessive intensity. Her love for him tinged with a constant, underlying fear, a fear that the Old One, though currently quiescent, was not truly gone, merely waiting for Samuel to grow older, for his connection to Oakhaven, however damaged, to reassert itself, waiting for another opportunity to reclaim what it considered its own. She found herself drawn to the old ways, not of Oakhaven, but of a deeper, more universal understanding of the world. She read about folk magic, about protective charms, about the power of symbols and intentions. She began to create small, subtle wards around their apartment, around Samuel's crib, sprigs of rosemary, circles of salt, objects of personal significance imbued with her fierce maternal will. They were small, desperate gestures, perhaps futile against a power as ancient and vast as the Old One, but they were all she had. They were her acts of desperate defiance, her ongoing war against the encroaching darkness. They knew, with a chilling certainty, that they could never truly escape Oakhaven. It was a part of them now, a shadow woven into the fabric of their lives, into the very soul of their son. They could move, they could change their names, they could try to build a new life, but the memory, the trauma, the knowledge of what lay hidden in that cursed valley would always be with them. And the fear, the gnawing, insidious fear that Oakhaven and its ancient, hungry god was not yet finished with them would forever linger. Their desperate defiance had bought them time, had saved their son, for now. But the ancient pact, though battered and bruised, was not necessarily broken, and the Old One, Elara suspected, was patient. It had waited for generations. It could wait again. The question that haunted her darkest hours was not if Oakhaven would reach for them again, but when. And what terrible form its next visitation would take. The silence from the cursed valley was, perhaps, the most terrifying threat of all. Chapter 14. The Covenant Broken. Years passed. 5, then 10. Elara and Ben, driven by a restless, unacknowledged fear, moved frequently, never staying in one place for too long. Always looking over their shoulders, always listening for the faint, familiar whispers, the scratching sounds, the sweet, cloying scent of Madame Lavoie. They became adept at creating new identities, at blending in, at leaving no trace. They were fugitives, not from a law, but from a far more ancient, implacable pursuer. Samuel grew from a quiet, watchful baby into a quiet, introspective boy. The small, silvery scar on his palm remained, a faint, almost invisible reminder of the night his soul had been bought back from the brink. His eyes, a clear, intelligent blue, held no trace of Oakhaven's unnatural darkness. Yet there was a depth to his gaze, a knowingness that sometimes unsettled Elara, a hint of an old soul residing in a young body. He was a solitary child, content with his own company, his imagination vivid, his dreams often troubled. He never spoke of Oakhaven, of course. He had been too young to remember. But sometimes, Elara would see him staring out of the window, his gaze fixed on some distant, unseen point, a strange, melancholic expression on his face, and she would wonder what echoes of that cursed valley still resonated within him, what fragments of that ancient, terrible connection still lingered in the deepest recesses of his being. Ben's research into the Old One and its ilk had become obsession, a way of trying to understand, to control, the amorphous, existential dread that haunted their lives. He amassed a small library of obscure texts, of grimoires and forgotten histories. His knowledge of ancient cults, of chthonic deities, of the delicate, often terrifying balance between humanity and the primal forces of the earth, growing encyclopedic. He learned of other Oakhaven-like places, other isolated communities bound by dark pacts, other Lavoie-like figures who served as intermediaries, as conduits for ancient terrestrial powers. He discovered that these entities, these old ones, were not necessarily malevolent in a human sense, but were elemental, amoral. Their hunger, their need for appeasement, for sacrifice, was as natural, as inevitable, as the changing of the seasons, as the cycle of life and death. And when that balance was disrupted, when the pact was broken, when the tithe was not paid, they would seek to restore it, often with a terrifying, indiscriminate fury. The destruction of Madame Lavoie, Ben came to believe, had created a vacuum, a dangerous imbalance in Oakhaven. The Old One, deprived of its priestess, its conduit, its accustomed offerings, was adrift. Its power, though still immense, was unfocused, untamed. The villagers, without Lavoie to guide them, to interpret the will of their dark god, were presumably living in a state of constant, superstitious terror, their carefully ordered world thrown into chaos. And Samuel, the child who had defied the pact, the child who carried the faint, residual scent of Oakhaven's taint, remained a focal point, a potential solution, a beacon for that unappeased, ancient hunger. Their desperate act with the silver letter opener had severed the immediate connection, had wounded the Old One's claim, but it had not extinguished it. It had merely postponed it. The visitations, the subtle, unsettling manifestations of Oakhaven's reach had ceased after that terrible night. For years, they lived in a fragile, anxious peace, always vigilant, always listening, but undisturbed. Elara almost dared to hope that they had truly escaped, that Samuel was finally, irrevocably free. But Ben, with his deeper, more academic understanding of the forces they had confronted, was less sanguine. He knew that these ancient powers operated on timescales far beyond human comprehension. A decade to the Old One was but a fleeting moment. It could wait. It could bide its time. And then, one autumn evening, when Samuel was 10 years old, it began again. It started subtly, just as before. A faint, almost imperceptible, sweet, herbal scent in the air. A scent that only Elara, with her heightened, trauma-informed senses, could detect. A fleeting glimpse of a shadowy figure at the edge of her vision. A renewed restlessness in Samuel. A return of that unnerving, watchful stillness. A darkening of his clear blue eyes. Elara's blood ran cold. It was happening again. Oakhaven was stirring. The Old One was reawakening. Its hunger, unappeased for too long, was growing. And it was, once again, reaching for her son. This time, however, they were not unprepared. Ben, armed with his years of research, his knowledge of ancient rites and forgotten lore, had anticipated this. He had made preparations. He had transformed their small, anonymous apartment into a fortress, not of brick and mortar, but of symbols, of wards, of carefully constructed defenses based on the arcane principles he had so diligently studied. He had inscribed ancient, protective sigils on the doorframes, on the windowsills, their forms drawn from texts that predated Oakhaven by millennia. He had placed bowls of salt, of iron filings, of specific herbs known for their apotropaic qualities in every room. He had created a circle of protection around Samuel's bed, woven from rowan wood and silver thread, its perimeter marked by carefully chosen stones, each one imbued with a specific intention, a specific prayer. They were desperate measures, drawn from a disparate collection of forgotten beliefs, their efficacy uncertain, their power untested against an entity as ancient and vast as the Old One. But they were all they had. They were their acts of desperate, informed defiance. The manifestations escalated quickly, more aggressively this time, as if the Old One, having been thwarted once, was now more determined, more focused, its patience finally exhausted. The shadowy figures were no longer fleeting, but lingered, their forms more substantial, their Oakhaven faces clearly visible, their eyes burning with a cold, hungry light. The scratching and tapping sounds returned, louder now, more insistent, as if something were trying to tear its way through the very walls of their apartment. The sweet, herbal scent of Lavoie was a constant, cloying presence, a chilling reminder of her enduring, spectral influence. Samuel, though older now, was deeply affected. He grew pale, withdrawn, his sleep plagued by terrifying nightmares he couldn't articulate. The darkness in his eyes deepened, threatening to consume the fragile blue, his connection to Oakhaven, to the Old One, reasserting itself with a terrifying, undeniable force. But this time, Ben's wards, his carefully constructed defenses, seemed to be having an effect. The shadowy figures could not cross the threshold of their apartment. The scratching sounds were confined to the exterior walls. The oppressive, malevolent presence, though palpable, seemed unable to fully penetrate their sanctuary. It was a siege, a battle of wills, of ancient power versus desperate, informed resistance. Elara and Ben took turns watching over Samuel, reinforcing the wards, reciting the ancient, protective incantations Ben had found in his texts. They were exhausted, terrified, but they were fighting. They were no longer just victims. They were combatants in a war for their son's soul. The covenant that Oakhaven had made with its dark god. The covenant that Madame Lavoie had enforced for generations. The covenant that they had so desperately, so violently defied was broken. But the Old One, it was now terrifyingly clear, was not willing to let its claim go unanswered. It was seeking to re-establish its dominion, to reclaim its due, to restore the ancient, terrible balance. And Samuel, the boy who had cried, the boy who carried the scar of Oakhaven on his palm, was once again at the heart of the storm. The broken covenant was demanding a new reckoning, and the price, Elara feared, might be even more terrible than before. Chapter 15, The Lingering Silence. The siege lasted for 7 days and 7 nights, a relentless, terrifying assault on their fragile sanctuary, on their fraying nerves, on their dwindling hope. The shadowy Oakhaven figures, their forms growing increasingly distorted, almost inhuman, pressed against the windows, their pale, hungry faces contorted in silent snarls, their cold, dead eyes fixed on Samuel. The scratching and tapping sounds became a maddening, percussive cacophony, as if a legion of unseen entities were trying to claw their way into the apartment. The sweet, herbal scent of Lavoie, now mingled with the rank, earthy odor of the Old One, was a constant, nauseating presence, so thick it was almost visible, a shimmering, malevolent miasma that clung to the air. Samuel, trapped in the eye of this supernatural storm, grew weaker, his small body racked with tremors, his breathing shallow. The darkness in his eyes almost complete. He no longer spoke, no longer responded to Elara's desperate pleas, his consciousness seemingly withdrawn, retreating into some deep, inaccessible part of himself, or perhaps being pulled into the cold, alien embrace of the Old One. Ben's wards, though surprisingly resilient, were beginning to fail. The protective sigils on the door frames and windowsills glowed with an unhealthy, feverish light, then flickered and died, one by one. The bowls of salt and iron filings turned black, corrupted by the encroaching, malevolent energy. The rowan wood and silver thread circle around Samuel's bed, their last line of defense, began to fray, to unravel, its protective power waning. Elara and Ben, exhausted, sleep-deprived, their spirits battered, fought on with a desperate, almost mechanical determination, reinforcing the wards, reciting the ancient incantations. Their voices hoarse, their hope dwindling with each passing hour. They knew, with a chilling certainty, that they were losing. The Old One, with its ancient, implacable power, its insatiable hunger, was too strong, too vast, too relentless. Their desperate defiance, their carefully constructed defenses, were ultimately no match for an entity that had held a valley in its thrall for centuries, that had feasted on generations of silent, black-eyed children. On the 7th night, as a wild, unseasonal storm raged outside, mirroring the tempest that had accompanied Samuel's birth 10 years earlier, the final ward failed. The rowan wood and silver thread circle around Samuel's bed snapped, its protective energy dissipating with a soft, sighing sound, like a dying breath. In that instant, the oppressive, malevolent presence that had been held at bay surged into the room, a wave of icy, suffocating cold that extinguished the last vestiges of their hope. The shadowy figures at the window dissolved, their forms seeming to flow into the room, coalescing around Samuel's bed, their pale, hungry faces looming over him, their cold, dead eyes gleaming with a terrifying, triumphant light. Samuel arched his back, a silent scream contorting his small face, his black eyes wide, unseeing, fixed on some unseen, unimaginable horror. The Old One had breached their defenses. It had come to claim its due. Elara and Ben rushed to Samuel's side, their bodies a fragile, human shield against the encroaching, inhuman darkness. But they knew, with a despair that crushed their souls, that it was too late. They had fought, they had defied, they had sacrificed, but they had failed. Oakhaven and its ancient, terrible god had won. And then Samuel, his small body convulsing, his black eyes rolling back in his head, spoke. Not in his own voice, not in the voice of a 10-year-old boy, but in a voice that was ancient, vast, resonant, a voice that seemed to emanate from the very earth, from the depths of time, from the heart of the Old One itself. The tithe is overdue, the voice rasped, each word a drawn-out, guttural pronouncement that vibrated through the room, shaking the very foundations of their beings. The balance must be restored. Tears streamed down Elara's face as she clutched her son's hand, the small, silvery scar on his palm a poignant, heartbreaking reminder of their earlier, futile defiance. "He is my son," she whispered, her voice choked with grief and a desperate, unyielding love. "Not yours. Never yours." The ancient, terrible voice chuckled, a dry, rasping sound like stones grinding together. "He was always mine, from the beginning. The seed was sown. The fruit is ripe." The shadowy figures around Samuel's bed reached out, their forms becoming more substantial, their hands like gnarled, skeletal branches, their touch icy cold, their intent unmistakable. They were going to take him. They were going to drag him back to Oakhaven, back to the silent, cursed valley, back to the embrace of their dark, insatiable god. But Ben, his face a mask of grim, unyielding resolve, stepped forward. He held no weapon, no ward, no arcane artifact. He held only the knowledge he had gleaned from his years of desperate research, a single, fragile understanding of the ancient, terrible power they confronted. "You speak of balance," he said, his voice surprisingly steady, clear, and carrying in the oppressive, malevolent silence. "You speak of tithes, of debts, but what of the debt owed to us? To this child? You, and your servant Lavoie, you stole his innocence. You tried to steal his soul. You have haunted us, hunted us, for 10 long years. Is that balance? Is that justice?" The ancient voice paused, a flicker of something. Surprise? Confusion? In its resonant depths, the shadowy figures hesitated, their gnarled hands hovering over Samuel. "A life for a life," Ben continued, his voice gaining strength, his gaze fixed on the unseen entity that spoke through his son. "That is the oldest law, is it not? The oldest balance. Madame Lavoie, she paid her price. Her life for the sacrilege she committed, for the imbalance she created. Is that not enough? Must this child, this innocent, also pay for her sins, for Oakhaven's ancient, bloody pact?" Silence. A profound, unnerving silence, broken only by the howl of the storm outside and Samuel's shallow, ragged breathing. The shadowy figures remained frozen, their forms beginning to waver, to lose their substance, as if the ancient power that animated them were considering, re-evaluating. "The covenant is broken," the ancient voice finally rasped, its tone less certain now, tinged with a grudging, reluctant acknowledgement. "The priestess is gone. The line is ended." "Then let it end," Elara pleaded, her voice raw with a desperate hope. "Let Oakhaven's darkness consume itself. Let the silence return to your valley. But leave this child. He is not yours. He He never was. He chose to cry. He chose life. He chose us. Another long, profound silence. The shadowy figures around Samuel's bed began to recede, to dissolve, their forms fading back into the encroaching darkness from which they had come. The oppressive, malevolent presence in the room lessened, the icy coldness replaced by a more neutral chill. Samuel's small body relaxed, his breathing deepening, the unnatural blackness in his eyes slowly, almost imperceptibly, beginning to recede, replaced once more by that faint, fragile, stormy blue. The ancient voice spoke one last time, its tone distant now, fading like an echo from a forgotten age. The balance seeks its own level. The silence will endure. And then it was gone. The shadows retreated. The malevolent presence vanished. The sweet, herbal scent of Lavoie and the older, earthier aroma of the old one dissipated, leaving only the clean, cold scent of the storm. Elara and Ben collapsed, exhausted, their bodies trembling, their minds reeling from the ordeal. Samuel lay still, his breathing soft and regular, his eyes, when they fluttered open, a clear, untroubled blue. The small, silvery scar on his palm seemed to glow faintly for a moment, then faded. The siege was over. The reckoning, it seemed, was complete. They had faced Oakhaven's ancient, terrible power, and they had somehow survived. Not through violence, not through magic, but through an appeal to an even older, more fundamental law, the law of balance, of consequences, of a debt paid in full. Epilogue. Months later, far from the scene of their last, terrifying encounter, Elara, Ben, and Samuel lived a quiet, unassuming life. The nightmares had faded. The fear, though never entirely gone, had receded to a dull, manageable ache. Samuel, now almost 11, was a normal, healthy boy, his eyes a clear, intelligent blue, the scar on his palm a faint, almost invisible line. He laughed, he played, he argued with his parents. He was, in every way that mattered, free. Yet, sometimes in the dead of night, Elara would wake and she would listen. Listen for the faint, familiar whispers, for the scratching sounds, for the sweet, cloying scent of Madame Lavoie. But there was only silence, a profound, enduring silence. Oakhaven and its ancient, terrible god had finally, it seemed, fallen back into its own cursed, forgotten slumber. The covenant was broken. The line was ended. But the lingering silence, Elara knew, would forever be a part of their story, a chilling reminder of the darkness they had faced, the price they had paid, and the fragile, precious gift of their son's reclaimed soul. And so ends the tale of Oakhaven'S curse and the children of Madame Lavoie. A reminder that some silences are born of ancient evils, and some cries, however small, can shatter the oldest, darkest pacts. If this story chilled you to the bone, if it kept you glued to the edge of your seat, please do me a kindness. Like this video, leave a comment with your thoughts, your fears, your own encounters with the unexplained. And most importantly, subscribe to the Eli Nightfall channel, for the darkness has many stories yet to tell, and I, your humble narrator, will be here to share them with you. Until next time, try to sleep well, if you can.